Chapter 823. After a night of heavy snow, although it cleared up at dawn, the temperature still plummeted. Who knew how many people were caught off guard by this first snow, and because they didn't have any clothes to wear, they were so cold that they cried for their parents. In the Li family in the greenhouse, because the copper pipes close to the wall circulated hot water, after closing the door they didn't feel cold at all. In the past, Xuanhuan would have run to the yard to make a snowman, but today she just moved a small stool and sat in front of the bed, looking at the little eyes in the swaddling clothes. She had been looking for almost an hour, but she still couldn't get enough of it. After a while she turned back and whispered, "Hee, his nose is like the son-in-law and his eyes are like Miss." Nonsense, he didn't even open his eyes. Li gently knocked on her head. Xuanhuan immediately retracted her head and whispered, "I saw him last night." As a person who had lived 2 lives, this was his first child. Naturally, Li couldn't get enough of it, but he didn't think the child looked like anyone or not. A newborn child didn't even have eyes and eyebrows, so these things couldn't be seen. Sitting on the bed, Rui's face was a little pale. Giving birth was hard for women, and it was like walking through the gates of hell. Even a grandmaster was not much better than an ordinary person. She looked at the child, and a faint smile appeared on her slightly tired face. Then she sighed and said, "It's a pity that you like daughters." Although she said this, she didn't know how happy she was. Some ideas were deeply rooted here, and even Rui couldn't avoid them. Li tucked her in and said, "It's okay, we can have more in the future. There will be daughters." Outsiders were not allowed in the confinement room. Although only Rui and Xuanhuan were here, hearing this she couldn't help blushing. She changed the topic and said, "Husband, what do you think we should name him?" In fact, as early as a few months ago, Li and she had prepared a few names, both boys and girls. Li didn't name his children according to the Li family's genealogy, nor did he plan to name his children in this way. Originally, if he had a daughter, it would be good to call her Li Si or Li Mui. For a boy, this name would be a bit feminine. Moreover, he was the eldest son of the Li family, so he naturally had to choose a more neutral name. There were already a few names that they could come up with, but the 2 of them had yet to decide which one to use. Li Xian? Li repeated the name, then shook his head and said, "I feel like I've heard this name somewhere before. It's not good." Li Xiaoyao? He read another one and shook his head. "This won't do. This life is too bitter and rough." "It's not good either. Li Bai, you're indeed suitable for the occasion, but I'm afraid that you won't be able to control it. Why don't we call him Dwainer?" Rui thought for a while, then looked at him and said, "He is the eldest son of the Li family. I hope that he can be a good person in the future and act according to the rules, so that he can be a good example to his younger brothers and sisters." Li Duan? Li didn't want to give the child any cool name. Li Duan was actually not bad, but it sounded a bit short. The word short made him feel uncomfortable no matter how he heard it. A name is just a form of address. Although it is good to have a meaning, it has little to do with one's character or fate in the future. Li thought for a while and said, "If a name can represent fate, then isn't Rui too much of an advantage?" As soon as he finished speaking, he was kicked lightly by Mississippi Lu. Li looked at the swaddled child. Since Rui could bring it up, it meant that she liked the name very much. He nodded and said, "Dwainer? Li Duan. Very good. I'll do as my wife says." The little servant girl looked at the child sleeping soundly in the swaddled clothes and said in a small voice, "Dwainer, Dwainer, you have a name. You guys have been busy all night yesterday. Go and rest first." Last night, after the child was born, everyone in the manor didn't sleep well. Li said to Xuanhuan and Mississippi Lu, then looked at Rui and said, "You haven't slept since yesterday. Go and rest for a while. I'll deal with the matters outside." The greenhouse was so quiet and peaceful, but in fact the outside had long been a boiling pot. Since last night, this place had become the focus of the entire capital. Especially after the news that County Marquis Li had a son and that both mother and son were safe spread out, many officials and nobles in the capital couldn't sit still. The carriages and horses that came to congratulate and give gifts had long been lined up 2 streets away. The servant girls and servants of the Li manor had all been mobilized. Just counting the rooms for storing gifts, they had already prepared 4 rooms. The youngest marquis in the court, the youngest minister of the golden-purple imperial court, and the emperor's most favored official, even the nobles and officials who usually didn't have any interaction had to prepare enough gifts at this time. The old emperor's edict came early in the morning. Other than bringing a lot of rewards, Rui's title of nobility was directly raised by 2 levels. After that, there was also the empress's decree, the princess's manor, the crown prince's manor, and more than a dozen carriages of gifts. Usually, Li didn't like to socialize, but today was different. Others came with gifts, so he had to go through the formalities. Just this formalities took him from dawn to dusk. When a servant came to tell him that the madam and the child had both woken up and that the madam was talking inside, Li found that the sky was already a bit dark. Dwainer, this is a good name. The smile on the face of the madam of the Li family hadn't stopped since last night. The old woman had been living in the manor for the past few days. She had originally fallen asleep yesterday, but she was suddenly woken up and hadn't slept since. Before the child was born, she seemed to be more anxious than Li. After the child was born, she was busy inside and outside, sending letters outside one after another. Until now she hadn't rested, but she seemed more energetic than anyone else. Although the other madam couldn't see, she was also sitting next to Rui's bed. At this moment she was holding her hand and saying something. Li listened. It should be some precautions during the confinement period. In fact, he didn't need someone to teach him these things. He knew it better than anyone else. Originally he wanted to persuade the two old people to go back and rest first, but seeing the situation in front of him, he felt that they probably wouldn't listen, so he quietly left. No matter what, his heart was still a little worried for so long that now, he could finally take a long breath of relief. Today, everyone in the manor was busy all day so that only a passage was swept out of the courtyard. In the courtyard, around the stone table, there was still a layer of not too thin snow. Li cleared a stone stool and sat down. Not long after, there was a crunching sound of stepping on the snow. Li Xian looked tired. He cleared another stone stool, sat next to Li Yi and asked, "Are you busy enough today? How do you have time to come over?" The reason why Li Yi asked this was because this afternoon, there was news from the palace that Li Xian's heir consort had also given birth. Both the adult and the child were safe, but it was a girl. Li Xian probably didn't have any other thoughts about this, but the heir consort would probably be sad for a while. Li Xian shook his head and said, "Her ladyship said that she needed to rest, so I stayed with her for a while. When she fell asleep, I directly came over." "Congratulations." Li Yi cupped his hands in a salute. Li Xian casually replied, "Congratulations to you too." The heir consort's body was weak, and it would probably affect the child. Li looked at him and asked, "How is the child's health?" Speaking of his daughter, a smile appeared on Li Xian's face. He said, "When she was born, she cried loudly and her body was a little weak, but the imperial physician said that she was fine for the first month, and then there were no problems." "What about the heir consort?" Li Xian shook his head and said, "She's fine. Her body is a little weak and this time her vitality might have been injured. She needs to rest, but it's not a big deal. However, she has always wanted to have a son." Li Yi could understand the heir consort's thoughts, but this matter couldn't be forced. He stood up and patted Li Xian's shoulder, saying, "If there's nothing else, try to persuade her. Actually, it's not bad to have a daughter." Chapter 824. It seems to be about the same as Brother Xian's child. I can't even tell if it's a boy or a girl. The proud lowly leaned against the window and looked around before saying, "Sir, is it very painful to give birth?" Yesterday when Sister Chiner gave birth, she was outside. That heart-wrenching sound still made her heart tremble. Li nodded and said, "Yes, it hurts a lot." The proud lowly hesitated for a moment before asking, "Then? How painful is it? Does it hurt more than the last time I cut my hand while cutting vegetables?" Last time when she was making soup for her father, she accidentally hurt her hand. At that time, those palace maids and eunuchs were all scared out of their wits, but she endured it and didn't let her father punish them. However, at that time she also felt that it was the most painful thing she had ever experienced. Li looked inside the room and saw a large and small figure on the bed. His gaze softened as he nodded and said, "It's 100 times, 1,000 times more painful than the pain of cutting your hand? 100 times, 1,000 times?" The proud lowly, who had excellent math scores, naturally knew what this meant. Her face turned pale and she ran, shouting as she ran, "Then I won't give birth, I won't give birth." Li rubbed his hands and covered Yongning's ears, which were red from the cold. He carried her into a room where a few of the Li residence's maids were busy. When he saw Li enter, he immediately stood up. Seeing that they were about to stand up and bow, Li waved his hand and said, "No need, sit down. How's the progress?" Replying to the Marquis, "It's almost done." "Let me see." Li Yi took the things they were sewing from one of the maids, nodded and said, "Not bad, continue." Although this thing wasn't like Sophie's elastic body that wouldn't leak no matter how hard it was turned, the effect was definitely much better than the one that was commonly used now. It could also be considered an invention that benefited thousands of women. However, he didn't want to be called the father of Triple X in the future, so it was better to inspire Li Xian. This could also be considered a new research project for the Academy of Sciences. Husband, what is this for? Rui leaned against the headboard, holding something in her hand. She looked at it over and over and then asked Li Yi in confusion. This. Li Yi leaned over and whispered a few words in her ear. Ah. Hearing this, Rui immediately threw the things in her hands aside and said with a red face, "This, husband, how can you do this by yourself? They didn't do it by hand. They sewed it." Rui was a little anxious. In short, if this gets out, it will be very improper. What will they say about you? Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Don't tell anyone about this. In short, this is better than the previous one. It's just right for us to use now, but it's not done yet. I'll ask them to hurry up." When he walked out of the door with the semi-finished product, a voice came from beside him. Mississippi Lu leaned against the door, pointed at the thing in his hand and asked, "What is this?" "You mean this?" Li Yi waved his hand and said, "Insoles." He looked at Mississippi Lu and said, "It's cold, isn't it? My feet will be cold if I don't pad my shoes with something. Do you want it? I'll ask them to make a few pairs for you." "Insoles?" Mississippi Lu looked at him with a look of disbelief. She pointed at the parts that extended from both sides of the insoles, and asked, "What is this?" "Wings." Li Yi looked at her in surprise. "Don't you think the insoles with wings are very beautiful?" Mississippi Lu stared at his eyes and asked, "What on earth is this?" Li Yi looked at her and asked uncertainly, "Insoles?" "Well, this is not an insole." She was not an outsider anyway. Li Yi looked around and whispered a few words in her ear. "Shameless." After listening, Mississippi Lu's face instantly turned red and she glared at him fiercely. Li Yi looked at her. "You're the one who asked. Can't you be reasonable, pervert? Don't you know the law? Shameless." "Shameless. I said it just now. Shameless." She glared at Li Yi again, snatched the thing from his hand and walked quickly into the room. "Hey, wait, I haven't told you how to use it." Mississippi Lu turned her head and looked at him calmly. She asked, "You want to teach me?" "No." Li Yi shook his head and said, "The insoles haven't been sewn yet. It was a great merit that could benefit all women in the world and be passed down for hundreds or even thousands of generations as long as human beings did not evolve further." However, he was still scolded as shameless. In this world there was really no law. However, in this world there were two people he could not talk to. The Princess Royal was one because she was the law. Mississippi Lu was the other because the price of talking to her about the law was too high, and ordinary people could not afford it. Logically speaking, the Li family had just added a child, so he should be very busy. According to etiquette, he should visit some people in person and report the good news in person. However, old Madam had already arranged all these for him. There was only one thing he needed to do, and that was to take care of Rui. Although her physique was far better than ordinary women, this kind of care was not only physical, but also spiritual. In terms of postpartum recovery, soup was indispensable. Li Yi did not dare to say how good his cooking skills were, but in terms of soup making he had definitely reached the level of a master. He was extraordinary and invincible in the world. Not long after entering the kitchen and placing the ingredients into the clay pot, a servant came to report that Minister Chen had come to visit. Although it was said that Minister Chen had come to visit, Li Yi knew that this had nothing to do with Chen Chong. He had Xuanhuan look after the soup and quickly walked out. Outside the residence, Chen Chong stood at the door, rubbing his hands in the cold. He did not forget to look back at the sedan and said, "Miaoyu, it's cold outside. Don't come down yet." Seeing Li Yi walk out, he reluctantly cupped his hands. County Marquis Li Yi quickly walked past Chen Chong. When third Miss Chen came down from the sedan, he softly said, "The ground is slippery, be careful." Then he frowned and looked back at Chen Chong. "How do you take care of people? It's such a cold day and you don't even prepare a fox fur coat. What are you thinking?" Chen Chong still maintained his cupped hands gesture. Behind him, a servant girl had already taken out a fox fur coat from the sedan and draped it over third Miss Chen. "It's so thin, can it keep out the cold? Can't you be more careful?" Li Yi glared at him again, then turned his head and said with a smile, "Quickly go in, it's warm inside." Second master." Seeing second master still maintaining his cupped hands gesture, the Chen family servant could not help but remind him. Chen Chong closed his eyes and took a deep breath before opening them again. He calmly said, "Go in." Walking side by side with third Miss Chen, she asked softly, "There were too many people in the residence these past few days, so I did not come over. Is Rui well?" Li smiled and nodded. Her body is recovering very well and the child is also very well. When she reached the door of the room she paused and shook her head. She just came from outside and is very cold. She can't stand these things the most right now. Let's sit in the greenhouse for a while before going over. Li thought for a moment, then nodded and said, the greenhouse is just next door. This way please. Xuanhuan, bring some tea and pastries over. After staying in the greenhouse for 15 minutes, Li led her over again. After sending her into the room, he placed a hand on Qin Chang's shoulder. What are you going in for? Don't you know any manners? Qin Chang's face twitched. He was about to explode when a petite figure ran over from the other side. Qin Chang froze for a moment, then quickly retracted the anger on his face. He immediately bowed. This lowly official pays his respects to Princess Xianxia. The proud Lolita ignored Qin Chang. Holding Li Yi's hand, she blinked pitifully and said, Sir, can I only have one child in the future? Chapter 825. What did the princess just say? After sending the proud Lolita off to play with Duanwu and Yongning, Qin Chang finally couldn't help but turn his head and ask, how would I know what to give birth to? Li Yi calmly glanced at him. How about I call the princess over and you ask her face to face? Qin Chang naturally didn't dare to ask her face to face. He asked in confusion, then what did your highness just say? Only one? Li Yi shook his head and said, perhaps she was talking about giving birth to a child? Qin Chang disdainfully glanced at him. It was one thing to have an ambiguous relationship with the eldest princess, but how old was Princess Xianxia? If he remembered correctly, Princess Xianxia was only 14 years old. According to the current laws of the Jing kingdom, she was not yet of age. No matter how much the emperor favored him, could he bear the crime of abducting the little princess? After entering the room and sitting down, Li Yi did not say anything. Although Qin Chang was a person who did not know how to read people, and Li Yi did not like him no matter how he looked at him, it was not a good idea to leave him here alone. When the third young mistress came out later and saw him here, she would not feel good either. Qin Chang knew that Li Yi was very dissatisfied with him, but they were under the eaves. Even if he was displeased, he could only endure it for the sake of his third sister. However, there was a limit to a person's patience. Even though this was a warm room, after a long time, the tea would turn cold and not taste good. The two of them were silent for a long time. The pastries that had been placed here had long been eaten by Li Yi alone. If he didn't even have tea to drink, he really didn't know what to do. The tea is cold, Qin Chang finally couldn't help but remind him. Li Yi glanced at him and said, herbal tea can clear away heat and relieve heat. It also has the effect of lowering internal heat. Official Qin seems to have quite a temper, so why don't you drink some more? Qin Chang took a deep breath and said, this official has been in a very good mood recently. I don't have any temper. Official Qin even has a pimple on his forehead. This is a sign of excessive internal heat. It's just that I've been sleeping a little late these past 2 days. Not only that, Lord Qin's eyes are bloodshot, and the corners of his mouth are rotting. These are all signs of excessive internal heat. I wonder if Lord Qin has been feeling thirsty and has been suffering from insomnia for the past few days. Qin Chang slammed his palm on the table. His eyes were bloodshot and his breathing was ragged. He bellowed angrily, this official said that there's no such thing. Alright, if Lord Qin says there isn't, then there isn't. Li Yi nodded and waved to a maid standing at the door. Go, bring another pot of herbal tea for Lord Qin. This Lord Qin really treated his kindness as ill intent. From his facial features, it was clear that he was suffering from excessive internal heat, but he still refused to admit that herbal tea was good for the body. Although the herbal tea of the Li family was not Jiaduo Bao or Wang Laoji, herbal tea sounded similar to cold tea, and the effect should not be much different, right? No matter what, the Li family was a wealthy family and anyone who came was a guest. As the head of the clan, was it really necessary for him to be so stingy as to not even offer a cup of hot tea? Li Yi shook his head and said, Lord Qin is busy with official business and overworked. It's not strange for these symptoms to appear. But although there are many official business, your health is equally important. Lord Qin should pay more attention. Compared to some people, he is indeed much busier. Qin Chang glanced at Li Yi and said, however, compared to some of his colleagues in court, he is still a little lacking. Assistant Minister Zheng of the Ministry of Revenue has been running around for the court these days, unable to enter his home. That is what is truly busy, Li Yi nodded and said, who would have thought that Assistant Minister Zheng, who is usually lazy and lethargic, would really put his life on the line when it comes to work. He is truly a role model for our generation. His tone changed as he said, From Lord Chen's words, it seems that you have some complaints about this. I have long heard that Lord Chen and Assistant Minister Zeng are close friends. Could it be that Lord Chen thinks that the court is too harsh on Assistant Minister Zeng? In reality, what he had heard was not close friends. Previously, there had been rumors in court about the love affair between Minister Qin Chong and Assistant Minister Zeng Shichen of the Ministry of Revenue. It was not something that could be described with just close friends. Of course, even if the rumors were true and the two of them were gay, that was their private matter. As outsiders, they had no right to meddle in their affairs. There are no complaints. However, a few days ago, when Assistant Minister Zeng and County Marquis Li were chatting in a tea house, there were rumors that the two of them did not get along. Chen Chong looked at Li Yi and seemed to be thinking of something. He opened his mouth and said, Assistant Minister Zeng works hard without complaint and is a pillar of the country. I hope that County Marquis Li will not be unable to distinguish between public and private affairs. Which rumors are these? Li Yi shook his head and said, Why would I purposely make things difficult for an important official over such a small matter? Moreover, these matters are not something that I can casually make decisions on. Li Yi took a sip of tea, but he was truly puzzled. Looking at Qin Chong's appearance, Zeng Shichen clearly did not reveal the conversation between the two of them that day. No wonder the King of Shu's faction had been too quiet these days. It was so quiet that even he was not used to it. He had originally thought that since they were able to endure all this and did not reveal it, it would definitely be a thunderous blow. Now, it seemed that Zeng Shichen had not told them what happened that day at all. Not normal, this was really not normal. While Li Yi was thinking about these things, Qin Chong's gaze was also fixed on his face. That day he knew that Zeng Shichen and Li Yi had a brief conversation, but Zeng Shichen had always been secretive about what they had talked about and was unwilling to reveal it. This made him even more puzzled. Of course, other than puzzled, there was also a trace of annoyance, or perhaps anger. Between the two of them, there were clearly some things that had been said very openly. At the very least he, Qin Chong, did not hide too much from Zeng Shichen, but the conversation between him and a third party, Li Yi, had actually been kept from him. Hateful, this was truly hateful. Official Chen, what's wrong? Li Yi looked at Qin Chong, who was suddenly filled with anger and had clearly lost his composure, and asked in confusion. It's nothing. Qin Chong glared at him fiercely and drained the cup of herbal tea in one gulp. Li Yi did not pay too much attention to it. He was just surprised by Zeng Shichen's behavior. To hide such an important matter and not report it, he was clearly an extremely unqualified teammate. Although Assistant Minister Zeng wasn't a good teammate, he was clearly a good opponent. Originally, he had wanted to ask him if the Chui family had made any moves recently. However, Sir Zeng had been working hard for the people these days and hadn't been able to see him for a long time. He didn't know if he could get any useful information from Steward Qin. Li Yi took down the teapot from the stove and poured a cup of hot tea for him. He casually asked, What has Official Chen been busy with these days? Qin Chong held the teacup to warm his hands and also casually replied, Nothing much, just thinking of a way to transfer His Highness, the King of Shu, back from Shuzhou. Capital Magistrate Dong Wenyun will soon be transferred to the Secretariat of Governmental Affairs. This position is extremely important and needs to be fought for. Also, Great Scholar Chu, who is known as the Scholar of the Jing Kingdom, has returned to the capital to give a lecture. The Chu family also needs to contact and recruit him. Li Yi really spat out a mouthful of tea. These two people were extremely important to the King of Shu's faction. Zeng Shichen knew about it but did not report it, and Qin Chong had casually leaked such important information to the enemy. Look, what kind of people the King of Shu and the Chui family had recruited. Under such circumstances, if they were allowed to succeed, where was the justice of the heavens? Where was the justice of the heavens? Chapter 826. Reality proved that hot tea seemed to be more effective at calming one's anger than cold tea. After a cup of hot tea, the anger on Chen Yizhang's face immediately subsided. Putting down the teacup, Qin Chong calmly looked at Li Yi and asked, Then what has County Marquis Li been busy with these days? For a moment, Li Yi could not figure out why Qin Chong had revealed all that information. Was it because of the cold tea and hot tea that his brain had become muddled, or was he purposely giving out false information to disrupt his rhythm? Or was it because he had found his conscience and was heartbroken that he had decided to forsake the darkness for the light? As expected, after saying so much, he was still trying to get information from him. His intentions were extremely bad. Li Yi raised his teacup and smiled. What else could he be busy with? Busy for nothing. Chen Yizhang put down the teacup and took a deep breath. The anger that he had just suppressed seemed to be on the verge of erupting again. Seemingly feeling that the room was stuffy, Qin Chong stood up, pulled aside the heavy curtains by the door and stood in the corridor. The servants of the Li family had long since cleared away the snow. Although the weather had become increasingly cold, there had been no more snow. Other than some white on the eaves, there was very little snow anywhere else. Qin Chong's breath condensed into white mist in the air as he said with his back to Li Yi, "That night, Miaoyu wanted to come and take a look. She thought about it for several days and did not sleep much these past few nights, so she decided to come today." Li Yi looked at the black tiles on the eaves and slowly said, "Third Miss can come here whenever she wants. There is no need to pick a time. But this place is still surnamed Li." Qin Chong turned back to look at him, his eyes unfocused and his expression somewhat perplexed. "Li Yi County Marquis Li, tell me what should I do?" At this moment, Qin Chong was something that Li Yi had never seen before. He was ruthless and decisive. This was the impression that Li Yi had of Qin Chong. But at this moment he truly felt the other's perplexity and hesitation. Although he did not know what he was perplexed about, it was probably an extremely important matter. He could not answer this question. Not far away, the heavy curtain of the room was lifted, and the figure of third Miss Chen walked out. Qin Chong looked back at Li Yi with a complicated gaze. Then he quickly walked in that direction. However, before he reached the corridor he suddenly stopped. Because two figures had appeared in front of third Miss Chen. "May I have a few words with you?" The blind old lady was supported by a woman. Although she couldn't see, she still raised her head. Chen Miaoyu was taken aback for a moment. She asked doubtfully, "I wonder if the old man?" Old mistress lowered her head and said with a trembling voice, "Lady Jade is my daughter." Hearing this name, Chen Miaoyu's body trembled. Her originally rosy complexion turned pale in an instant, and all the blood drained from her face. Qin Chong paled. Just as he was about to go over, a hand pressed down on his shoulder from behind. Li Yi looked ahead and said in a low voice, "She will feel better if we talk things out." As if her soul had been sucked out of her body, she walked into the room in a daze. The name Lady Jade still echoed in Qin Miaoyu's ears. How could she forget this name? How could she dare to forget it? Her husband, her soon-to-be married husband, had held that woman's hand and left her. This name had been forever engraved in her heart. It could never be erased. Every time she touched it, she would feel a pain that was no less painful than when she had carved it with a knife. Two noises came from the front, causing her to snap out of her thoughts at this moment. The old lady and the woman had knelt down in front of her. The old lady's voice was choked with emotion. "Miss, our He family has let you down?" Seeing that Qin Chong had suddenly become anxious and was pacing back and forth, his fists clenched so tightly that the veins on his hands were bulging, Li shook his head and said, "Official Qin, would you like to go in for a cup of tea?" Qin Chong impatiently waved his hand. Just as he was about to speak, he suddenly stopped and bowed. This lowly official pays his respects to the princess. The proud Lolita clasped her hands behind her back and walked back in a ladylike manner. She nodded and said, "I have something to say to sir. Go to the side first." "Yes." Hearing this, Qin Chong glanced at Li Yi, then turned and strode away. The proud Lolita skipped over to Li Yi and said, "Sir, I'm not afraid of pain. I've decided. I want to have 2 children in the future, a boy and a girl. It's just right." Crack. Qin Chong, who had been about to walk down the corridor, twisted his leg and stumbled. His entire body rolled down. He curled up on the cold ground and hugged his ankles. The veins on his forehead bulged and he broke out in a cold sweat. However, he did not care at all. His eyes were wide open as he stared at Li Yi, who was standing on top of him. He could not make a single sound. What's wrong with official Qin? How could he be so careless?" Li Yi walked over in shock. He waved his hand at a servant of the Li family and ordered, Quick, call a doctor over, Yu." Qin Chong's face was filled with shock. In a low voice he said, You're disgraceful." Li Yi frowned and crouched down to look at him. He asked, "Official Chen, what are you saying? How am I disgraceful?" I heard everything just now." Qin Chong's forehead was covered in cold sweat. His face was scrunched up in pain, but he was not talking about his sprained ankle. "The princess said that she wants to give you children too. How could such a private conversation be heard by an outsider?" When the proud Lolita who had followed them heard this, she covered her face and ran away. Li rubbed the space between his brows and said, "The princess is still young. A child's words carry no harm. Official Qin, could it be that you think I'm such an unreasonable person?" The suspicion on Qin Chong's face lessened. Indeed, with the princess's status, if something like that really happened, she would not be standing here talking to him right now. Then his face darkened and he said, "The princess's body is priceless. No matter how close the two of you are, you still have to pay attention to these things." Fortunately, only this official heard it today. If it were to reach His Majesty's ears, these words sounded strange to Li Yi. What did she mean by fortunately only he heard it today? This should be counted as unfortunate, right? However, Xianxia was used to spouting nonsense. Sometimes she would not restrain herself in front of the old emperor. Other than herself, no one would take her words seriously. Even so, it was time for him to have a proper talk with her about these matters. If this continued and he encountered people with ulterior motives, they might really accuse him of abducting the princess. Li looked at Qin Chong and nodded. "Official Qin, do not worry. I have always done things with a clear conscience. In the future, I will remind the princess." "Clear conscience?" Qin Chong snorted. "Including the uncooked dumplings that you gave this official and assistant minister Zim?" Li was startled and asked in surprise, "Ah, uncooked? Let's not bring up the matters of the past in the future. You don't owe me anything and I don't owe you anything." Inside the room, Chen Miaoyu helped the old man up and calmly said these words. Then she pushed open the door and walked out. When she saw the situation in the courtyard, her expression changed. She quickly walked over and asked in concern, "Second brother, what's wrong?" Qin Chong gave a dry smile and said, "The road was slippery and I accidentally fell." Crack. The slovenly old man shook his wrist and stood up. "It's just a sprain. It's not a big deal. After you go back and rest for 3 to 5 days, you'll be able to walk normally." Qin Chong touched his ankle in surprise and found that it really didn't hurt anymore. He raised his head and asked, "I can get up now? If you don't feel that your butt is cold, you can lie down a bit longer." The slovenly old man lightly tossed out these words and left with a flick of his sleeve. Li smiled and said, "Our family's physician has a rather bad temper. Please don't mind him." After sending off third young Miss Qin and the limping Qin Chong, he walked back, feeling as if he had forgotten something. At a certain moment, he suddenly exclaimed, "My soup!" Fortunately, Xuanhuan was watching and he didn't miss the time. Li scooped a bowl of soup and sat by the bed. After blowing on it to cool it, he fed it to Rui's mouth. Rui opened her mouth a few times, then shook her head and said, "This is so strange. Husband, leave it. I'll do it myself. Be obedient. I rarely feed people soup like this." Li put the spoon to his mouth and blew on it. He said, "If you don't believe me, you can ask Rui." At that time I directly what? Mississippi Lu walked out from the inner room and scooped a small bowl for herself. She looked at Li Yi and asked, "Directly, yes, directly." Li looked at her as she picked up the spoon and immediately said, "Put it down. This soup, you can't drink this soup." "Why?" Mississippi Lu frowned and looked at him. He couldn't just directly tell her that the greatest effect of this soup was that it was good for breasts and that if she drank it, her breasts would swell. If that happened, he would be labeled as a shameless hooligan. Li Yi thought for a moment and said, "This soup can only be drunk after having children. Otherwise. Anyway, when you have children in the future, I'll boil it for you." Xuanhuan had already taken a bowl and walked out from the inner room. When she heard the son-in-law say that he couldn't drink this soup before having children, she put the bowl down again. Then she seemed to have thought of something and asked in confusion, "Strange. If second young miss has children, why is son-in-law making soup?" Chapter 827. Second miss had a child. Why did the son-in-law make soup? In the eyes of the little servant girl, this matter was very strange. But after she asked this question, everyone's expression became strange. The son-in-law even slapped her butt to stop her from talking nonsense. How was this nonsense? When second miss had a child in the future, things like making soup would naturally be done by her husband. How could it be the son-in-law? Unless, the little servant girl had already walked out of the door but suddenly stopped. Her pretty face showed a look of realization. Right, in this way the son-in-law was still the son-in-law, second miss was still second miss, and it was reasonable for the son-in-law to make soup for second Mississippi. She was originally worried that after second miss got married, she would not be able to see her often. If this was the case, they would still be together in the future. Wouldn't there be nothing to worry about? Thinking of this, the little servant girl's big bright eyes could not help but become brighter. Because a problem that had troubled her for a long time seemed to have found a perfect solution. Li Yi found that Xuanhuan had been talking more and more openly recently. She always mentioned the topic of making soup intentionally or unintentionally. Mississippi Lu would not blame her, but the way she looked at him was strange. Although he was open-minded, he could not help but feel guilty when she looked at him like this for a long time. He did not know what she was thinking. Was she worried that he would have any thoughts about her? How could that be possible? She was Lu Rui, the vicious second daughter of the Lu family. She was the biggest evil force in the family. How could he have any thoughts about her? Yes, probably, maybe. Impossible, right? Compared with Mississippi Lu, who became more and more strange and made him feel uncertain, Rui made him feel much more at ease. After all, she was not an ordinary woman. In terms of physique, she was already at the peak of the world's women. In addition, she was nourished by various decoctions. In fact, her body had almost recovered half a month after giving birth. The confinement room was almost airtight. Although she would breathe regularly every day, it would still be stuffy after a long time. She only lived in it for half a month before moving out. Li looked at the little fellow in the swaddling clothes and touched his nose. Although it was only 1 month and he could not even crawl, he would deliberately hide in Rui's arms. Li helped him tuck in the swaddling clothes and whispered, "Dwainer, be a good boy and call me father." Rui could not help laughing and shook her head. "Husband, you are too impatient. How can a child speak so fast?" "At least a few months later he will call me father." Li thought for a moment and suddenly said, "Wife, why don't we bet on whether he learns to call me father or mother first?" A smile appeared on Rui's pretty face and she said, "Then my husband will definitely lose. He has been by my side from morning to night, so he must have learned to call me mother first." "Not necessarily." Li shook his head and said, "This kind of thing still depends on luck." Looking at him, Rui asked, "Then how do you want to bet?" Li thought for a moment and said, "How about the bet? The loser will agree to one condition of the winner." "Okay." Rui did not hesitate either. She looked at him and said, "Husband, you must keep your word." "I will be the judge, I will be the judge." Lolita rolled her eyes and said, "I will be the judge for Sir and Sister Rui." Li patted her head gently and said, "What are you doing? You need a referee to make a bet. Sir, you even let Yongning be the referee when we made a bet." The Tsundra Lolita kept shaking her head, then said, "However, the referee can also participate in the bet." Li said helplessly, Okay. You can be the judge if you want." Rui smiled as she watched her run out. She looked down at the swaddling clothes and said in a small voice, "Duaner has fallen asleep again." Li took the little fellow from her arms and put him in the wooden crib. He turned back and said, "You've been holding him for 2 hours. You didn't sleep well last night. Let him sleep. You go rest for a while." Rui shook her head and said, "It's okay. I'm not tired. I will stay here and guard him. If he wakes up, there are maids watching here. They will call you when he wakes up." "It's okay." Li shook his head and strode over. He carried her in his arms and walked out of the door. The 2 maids at the door lowered their heads. Rui blushed and whispered, "Husband, there are so many people watching." "So what if there are so many people watching? Can't I hold my own wife?" Li shook his head and kicked open the door of the room next door. He put her on the bed and took off her shoes and coat. Finally, he covered her with a quilt. Li looked at her and whispered, "Sleep? He takes a long nap. He won't wake up for a while." Rui nodded slightly. Her eyelashes blinked a few times and she slowly closed her eyes. Li gently closed the door and stood in the corridor looking outside. It was the beginning of the 12th lunar month. It had snowed last night, but it was not thick. The old emperor's illness would relapse in winter. It was said that it had worsened these days and he had been bedridden for several days. It was close to the end of the year and the academy was closed. The old emperor was bedridden and needed to recuperate. He could not be disturbed. Yongning and Shanning had been staying here these days and only went back at night. Although the old emperor could only live in the warm room, he only needed to endure for another month. If he continued to maintain this state of retirement in the spring of next year and did not receive any major stimulation, it should not be a big problem to continue living for another year and a half. However, with his physical condition, he should not be able to participate in this year's court meeting. But with Her Royal Highness, it did not matter whether he participated or not. Speaking of Her Royal Highness, Li realized that he had not seen her for a while. The end of the year was approaching. There must be a lot of things to do in the court. The court meeting in half a month's time needed to start preparing now. He thought for a moment and turned his head. He ordered a servant in the corridor, "Prepare the carriage. Let's go to the palace." In front of the Li residence, the carriage slowly moved. After a full quarter of an hour, a small figure slipped into a room. The proud Lolita looked at the sleeping child in the stroller and whispered in a voice that only she could hear, "Dwainer, you have to call Xianxia first." Outside the Li residence, a carriage came from a distance and finally stopped. Inside the carriage, Xiao Chui clenched her fists. She turned her head and asked worriedly, "Miss, are we really going in? How about we tell Lily first?" "No need, we are not here to see him." Zheng Zumo shook her head. She grabbed the hem of her clothes with both hands. After loosening her lips, she nodded and said, "Get off the carriage." Inside the residence, a door opened. Rui walked out from inside and asked Xuanhuan, who had just walked in from outside, "Did the son-in-law go out?" The servant girl nodded and said, "He has been out for a while. It seems that he went to the palace." She was relieved. If he saw that she did not sleep obediently, she would be scolded again. Just as she was about to check on the child, a servant hurried over. "Madam, there is a Miss Zheng outside visiting." The servant girl heard this and immediately widened her eyes. Rui was startled. After a moment of absent-mindedness, she immediately said, "Quickly go and invite the girl in." After that, she shook her head again. "Forget it, I will go myself." Chapter 828. Given official Dong's abilities and talents, it is a waste of talent to only be the governor of the capital. Emingzu put down a memorial and stood up. "I have talked to father. We plan to transfer him to the Hall of Governmental Affairs after the new year. According to father, it seems that he wants official Dong to take over Prime Minister Shin's position. The governor of the capital, Dong Wenyun. Li Yi had known him since he was at Qing and Fu. Of course, at that time he did not know that he was Prime Minister Shin's son-in-law. It sounded normal for a son-in-law to take over his father-in-law's position, but the Shin family still had a high-ranking official in court. Who knew if the brother-in-law and brother-in-law would fight over the position of Prime Minister? Of course, this was the Shin family's business. He did not worry about it. Speaking of this matter, Li Yi looked at her and asked, "The position of the capital governor is very important. After official Dong is transferred, who do you plan on letting take over?" Emingzu casually picked up a memorial from the table and said, "This is the candidate submitted by the Minister of Governmental Affairs. Actually, the most suitable person for this position is the governor of the capital, Lu Dayo. He is suitable to be a parent official, but he can only be a parent official. After reaching the position of capital governor, there is no need to go any higher. Going lower would be a waste of talent." Emingzu said and then shook her head. "However, his qualifications are still shallow. If we forcefully promote him, it will inevitably cause criticism. We can only wait until later to consider it." The Chui family, the Qin family, the Han family. Li Yi looked at the memorial and said, "They really know how to pick people. It looks like they are determined to get this position." He had heard Qin Chong mention that the Chui family was determined to get the position of capital governor. Among these nominees, almost all of them were officials in the King of Shu's faction. No matter how they chose, they could not avoid it. Emingzu walked over and said slowly, "Assistant Minister of Revenue, Tseng Shichen. This person is very capable. If we really had to choose from these people, only he can take on this heavy responsibility." Not to mention that she was only a temporary representative of the court, even a real emperor would have to ask his subordinates to select some important officials before choosing one of them. If they ignored the opinions of the officials and stubbornly acted on their own, the court would be in chaos. Of course, she was different from her father. Her father could make an exception to promote someone, but she did not have the right to do so. Although Tseng Shichen's name was at the end of the list, after some consideration she still felt that if she had to choose one of these people, Tseng Shichen was the most suitable one. It doesn't make sense to be promoted from the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue to the capital governor. Li Yi shook his head. In order to make up the numbers, the King of Shu's faction was really willing to report anyone and everyone. Tseng Shichen was in the Ministry of Revenue, and he was likely to take over the position of Minister of Revenue in the future. Wasn't that much better than being the capital governor? Although Minister Qin was in the prime, Tseng minister's position, it was a lot. Governor's position, Tseng was of minister. Li Yi continued, "Moreover, although Tseng Shichen is capable, he is too lazy. He leaves early every day. How can he be a qualified governor?" Old Zheng was different from the Qin and Chui families. This was a muddy water. In order to prevent trouble in the future, it was better to let him be the assistant minister of revenue. Emingzi looked at him in surprise. "Do you really have a prejudice against Tseng Shichen?" "It is just a matter of fact." Li Yi shook his head. "Even if Tseng Shichen was here, I would still dare to say this. Your Highness, Assistant Minister Zheng has entered the palace to report. He is waiting outside." A eunuch walked in and bowed. Emingzi looked at Li Yi and said, "Let him in." Tseng Shichen must have just returned to the capital. He had not gone home to change and looked travel-worn. He handed over a memorial with both hands and said, "Your subject has been ordered to supervise the taxation of the Beijing-Hebei region. This is the detailed report. Your Highness, please have a look." When the eunuch took the booklet and handed it over, he raised his head and looked at Li Yi vaguely, then stood still on the spot. Emingzi looked through it carefully and nodded. "Very good. You have worked hard. This is my duty." Tsing Shichen bowed again. "Your Highness, if there is nothing else, I will take my leave." After Tsing Shichen left, Emingzi came over with the list and asked, "Then who do you think should take this position?" Li looked around and thought for a moment. He said, "Let's do as you say." Among these people, Tsing Shichen's status was special. Those on the King of Shu's side would definitely not think that the eldest princess would push the current Assistant Minister of Revenue to the position of capital governor. Thus, he was purely here to fill in the numbers. In this way, their arrangements and plans could be disrupted. It would also be beneficial for their future actions. After all, Lord Tseng was a good opponent that could only be found by chance. Thinking of the things that Qin Chong had mentioned, he casually asked, "Oh yes, there's one more thing. Are you familiar with Great Scholar Chu?" Emingzi suddenly raised her head and looked at him. She said in surprise, "Grand Tutor Chu?" Li shook his head. "What Grand Tutor? I don't know." Qin Chong said he was some Wunshin of the Jing Kingdom. Emingzi looked at him nervously and asked, "Grand Tutor Chu has just returned to the capital. What's wrong? You met him? Did you have any conflicts?" "I've only heard of him once. I haven't even met him. How can there be any conflicts?" Li looked at her in surprise. "Do I look like someone who gets into conflicts so easily?" Grand Tutor Chu was once Imperial Father's teacher. Even Prime Minister Qin and Prime Minister Shen have received his teachings. He was once in charge of the Imperial College and the Hongwen Library. All of the nobles in the capital and nearly half of the officials in the court can be considered his students. Grand Tutor Chu is someone that all the scholars in the world look up to. Emingzi looked at him and said seriously, "If you meet him, you'd better be respectful. If something really happens, even Imperial Father won't be able to protect you." "Don't worry. Why would I provoke him? I'm worried that he'll blackmail me." Li shook his head and waved his hand in farewell. "Continue with your work. I'm leaving." "Remember, the Chu family is not to be provoked," Emingzi reminded him worriedly. Li waved his hand casually. "I know. I won't provoke them for no reason." When he walked out, he was still a little confused and depressed. Why hadn't he heard of this Grand Tutor Chu before? According to Her Royal Highness, this old man had extremely high prestige and influence in both the court and the court. Her Royal Highness might not be able to compare with him. If such a person was recruited by the King of Shu, wouldn't their previous efforts be in vain? When Li Yi walked out of the palace gate, Tsing Shichen's figure was still walking slowly in front of him. Hearing the voice behind him, Tsing Shichen turned around and cupped his hands. "I have to thank County Marquis Li." Li Yi asked in surprise, "Why are you thanking me?" Tsing Shichen looked at him and said, "If it weren't for County Marquis Li, I wouldn't have to run around these days. I would have a more relaxed life." "You're welcome. It's what I should do." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "A pillar of the country like Lord Tseng should work hard for the country. Her Royal Highness just said that Lord Tseng is outstanding and does a good job. It's reasonable for you to work hard." Tseng Shichen raised his eyebrows. "County Marquis Li, you must put in a good word for me in front of Her Royal Highness, right?" "Of course." Li nodded and then waved his hand. "It's what I should do. Lord Tseng, you don't have to thank me." The two walked side by side. After walking out of the palace gate, Li Yi turned around and asked, "Last time in the tea house I heard Lord Tseng talk about the Eastern Palace, but I haven't asked for your opinion yet." Tseng Shichen looked at him, his eyes focused, and then he smiled and said, "I think that Lord Li is right. This is a matter of the royal family, and it should be decided by His Majesty alone. We, the foreign officials, should not worry about it." Li Yi nodded, looked at him, and said solemnly, "I'm afraid Lord Tseng should be prepared to take on more important tasks." Tseng Shichen was stunned and a trace of doubt appeared on his face. "What do you mean, County Marquis Li?" Li Yi waved his hand and turned to leave. "You'll know in the future." Chapter 829. Outside the door, the two maids clenched their fists tightly. They looked at each other and then pressed their ears to the door. Both of them had the urge to rush in if something went wrong. The atmosphere inside the room was much more harmonious. Zheng Zumo looked at the child in the swaddling clothes and smiled. "This child really looks like Madame Li." Rui still had a smile on her face. She looked down and said, "He looks more like my husband." Zheng Zumo looked down and saw the little fellow in her arms looking around. she said. His eyes are like Madame Li's and his nose is like his. Rui looked at her and suddenly reached out and asked, "Would you like to hold him?" Zheng Zumo was startled and then said in disbelief, "Can I?" "Of course." Rui handed the swaddling clothes over with a smile. Zheng Zumo carefully took it. The little fellow stared at her and then raised his hand with difficulty to touch the butterfly embroidered on her chest. Rui said with some surprise, "This child is usually shy with strangers. When he was hugged by strangers he would cry incessantly. It is strange today. He is not shy at all when he sees you." Zheng Zumo played with the little fellow's fingers with a smile and said, "Maybe I'm more popular with children. When I was in the Jade Courtyard, one of my sisters gave birth without telling her mother. She cried when everyone held her, she only finished half of her sentence and her voice gradually faded. At the same time, she lowered her head and carefully handed over the swaddling clothes. When she raised her head, a smile returned to her face. Okay, it is getting late. It is time for us to go back." Rui stood up and said, "I will see you out." No need. Zheng Zumo waved her hand and said, "I will go out by myself. Madam, rest. Xuanhuan, come and look after Dwainer. I will go out for a while," Rui said to the door. Then she looked at Zheng Zumo and smiled. "My body has been fine for a long time. Let's go." Son-in-law left in such a hurry this time. With his hands behind his back, Fang strolled to the entrance of the mansion. When he saw a familiar figure, he waved his hand out of habit. "What a coincidence, Miss Zheng. Come out, son-in-law is inside." After he said that, he was stunned for a moment. He raised his head and saw the words, "Li Residence." His eyes widened. When he looked over again he realized that there was more than one familiar figure. "Miss Zheng, eldest miss." Just as he opened his mouth, he slapped himself on the mouth and hurriedly corrected himself. "Eldest Miss Zheng, what a coincidence, both of you are going out." Rui looked at him and said in surprise, "Uncle Fang? Today's sun." Fang raised his head and looked at the winter sky that was filled with gray clouds. He muttered, "How did it disappear, Su?" When Li Yi lifted the curtain for the third time, he saw that the sloppy old man still had his eyes closed. He asked worriedly, "Can you drive the carriage like this?" The sloppy old man said lightly, "Don't worry. I don't need my eyes, but I can still see more clearly than others." Li Yi was still a little worried, so he simply lifted the curtain and sat outside. He looked at him and said in surprise, "If I remember correctly, Su wasn't like this before. Senior Lu taught me." Li Yi found that after returning from the Qi Kingdom, the sloppy old man became more and more of a man of few words. He quickly understood that Senior Lu was talking about his second granduncle. He didn't understand his words and asked, "What's the use of closing your eyes? If the eyes can't see, the heart can see more clearly." The sloppy old man still had his eyes closed. He said, "Your realm is too low, so it's normal that you don't understand." Li Yi thought about it and asked, "I wonder if Su has heard of the name Xiesun?" The sloppy old man's eyes suddenly opened and he asked, "You know Xiesun too?" "Ahem, I know a little." Li Yi roughly knew what had happened and said with a dry cough. The sloppy old man nodded and said, "That's right. Although Xiesun is a martial arts senior from 100 years ago, Senior Lu might have mentioned him to you before?" Li Yi nodded and asked, "Does Su know how the golden-haired Lion King Xiesun became blind?" "I don't know. Senior Lu didn't say. Do you know?" Li Yi nodded again. "Of course, but it's a long story." The sloppy old man sat up straight and waved his hand. "There's no rush. Tell me slowly." The story of the Lion King Xiesun had only just begun when they arrived at the doorstep. The sloppy old man was a little disappointed. Li Yi could only agree to tell him the next time they went out. He jumped off the carriage and watched as another carriage disappeared around the corner in the other direction. He shook his head in confusion and stepped into the mansion. In the room, Rui had just coaxed the child to sleep when Li Yi walked in. After taking a look, he asked suspiciously, "What's wrong with Xuanhuan?" She's stuttering as if she has something to say. She won't say a word when I ask her. "Is it because you didn't rest at noon and you don't want Xuanhuan to tell the truth?" "Of course not. I slept for a long time at noon." Rui helped the little fellow tuck in the corner of his back before whispering. Li looked at her and said, "Don't lie to me, my wife. If Xuanhuan doesn't tell me, I can ask someone else." "Why would I lie to you?" Rui shook her head and then a smile appeared on her face. She said, "You weren't here just now. Dwainer called me mother. You lost the bet this morning." "What?" Li stared at her with wide eyes. A 1-month-old child couldn't even make simple syllables except crying loudly. How could he say mother? Li shook his head and said, your husband has read a lot of books. Dwayner will need at least a few months to say mother. You can't lie to me. Rui looked up at him and said seriously, so, you don't believe me? Lee opened his mouth to say a word and found that it was a single-choice question. For such a young child, unless he was a monster, it was naturally impossible for him to produce such a difficult syllable. Lee could still tell if his child was a monster or not. But could he doubt Rui's words? Obviously not. However, the truth was the truth. It couldn't be shifted or changed by anyone's will. The truth might be late, but it would never be absent. This was what he taught Louis. On one side was the truth and on the other side was Rui. This was a multiple-choice question. It couldn't be simpler. Lee nodded and said with some regret, in that case I really lost. He sighed in his heart. Sisters were sisters after all. It turned out that Mississippi Lou was not the only one who knew this trick. Rui smiled and said, then do you remember that I can make a request of you? Of course your husband is a man of his word. Even if you want the stars in the sky, I will ask Fong to take them down. Rui almost never asked him for anything. Naturally, he wouldn't refuse her request. Fong probably wouldn't refuse it either. Then, Rui stood up and held his hand. She looked into his eyes and said seriously, husband, let Miss Zheng marry us. Chapter 830. Li had to admit that after Rui said this, his heart skipped a beat. More than a beat. I said, let Sister Zheng marry into our family. Rui looked at him and repeated. Li suddenly didn't know where to put his hands. It didn't seem right to put them outside. It didn't seem right to put them in his sleeves. It didn't seem right either. Put them in his pockets. There were no pockets. Rui took his hand and sat down by the bed. She said, Sister Zheng came just now. Only then did Li remember the carriage he saw at the gate of the mansion just now. His heart tightened again and he asked casually, what did you talk about? Just chatting casually. She came to see me and Dwayner, and she even brought the little shoes she made herself. Miss Zheng's needlework is better than mine. Dwayner also likes her very much. Rui smiled and looked at Li. Sister Zheng is really good. I can see that she likes husband as much as I do. Li looked at her. This kind of joke, others might make, but Rui would never make it, let alone a second time. Wife. Li opened his mouth, but was interrupted by her. Rui held his hand with a smile on her face. She asked, does husband like Sister Zheng? Yes. Li nodded. This was the only answer he could make at this moment. I'm sorry, Sister Zheng. Rui looked at him, suddenly lowered her head and said, I once went to find her without telling husband. Li looked at her in a daze. Neither Rui nor Zueimo had mentioned this to him. Rui said in a low voice, I asked her if she liked husband. If she liked him, she might as well marry into the Li family. When? Just a few days before husband left the capital. What did she say? She refused. Li clenched his other fist. It wasn't hard to imagine the situation and state of mind they were in at that time. No wonder she had been avoiding him for those days, and for Rui to personally go to Willow Lane and say these words to her, what kind of determination did she have? Rui held his hand tightly and said in a low voice, husband, I'm sorry. At that time, I only thought that if she could marry into the Li family she might be able to give birth to a child for you and the Li family. I was too selfish. Li let out a sigh of relief, shook his head and said, I'm the one who should say sorry. Don't say that, husband. Rui leaned on his shoulder and said, my husband is very good to me. I know that my husband cares about my feelings, so I can only let Miss Zheng suffer. Li put his arm around her waist and lowered his head to ask, now that we have Dwayner, why do you still let? Because little Sister Zheng is really good. Rui lowered her head and murmured, not to mention husband, even I am starting to like her. She suddenly raised her head and asked curiously, how did husband and Miss Zheng first meet? How did they meet? Li thought for a moment and said, I think I just came here, not long after I was caught by Rui and brought to the village. One time I went down the mountain and was brought to the jadeite courtyard by Li Xian. You know how Li Xian is? He's a playboy by nature and always goes to these brothels. I didn't want to go, but he dragged me. That day at the jadeite courtyard, I happened to see her performing. I mistook her for someone else and thought she was an old acquaintance. I lost my composure and interrupted her performance and was called a lecher. Old acquaintance? Rui looked up at him and asked, an old acquaintance who could make you lose your composure must be very important to you. Where is she now? How is she doing? Li was a little absent-minded and then said, it's been a long time. Now that I think about it, it seems like it happened in my previous life. As for her, I will never see her again. It was a misunderstanding, and at this time he could only explain it to Rui in this way. Rui lowered her head and said, "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have mentioned it." "It's okay." Li Yi helped her smooth the hair in front of her forehead and continued, "Speaking of it, it's not the first time. The first time was when I took her painting by mistake. The painting that husband hid in the study?" Yes, that's the one." Li Yi was stunned and then continued, "Later on at the jadeite courtyard, of course I was brought there by Li Xian and accidentally broke into her room. At that time she had just come out of the shower and then, if there's such a thing, then husband, it was a misunderstanding. That was a pure misunderstanding." Li Yi shook his head repeatedly. "Later on I accidentally saw her changing clothes. I didn't see anything that time. It was also a misunderstanding." "Did you see anything that time?" "No, that day. Later we moved to the capital. When we left, I wrote a few poems for her to compete for the title of courtesan belle, but I didn't know that she had long wanted to redeem herself. Once she became the courtesan belle, her value would increase greatly. She couldn't redeem herself and almost made things worse. There were more than a dozen of them." More than a dozen? Maybe I remembered it wrong. Later on she came to the capital and helped in the brothel and then helped in the clothing store. For a period of time, some people in the capital targeted me, which affected her a lot. She was almost wronged and imprisoned." Rui blinked and asked, "Then you fell in love with her after a long time?" "No." Li shook his head and said, "It hasn't reached that stage yet." "Then has it reached that stage yet?" "Except for those few accidents, they actually didn't even hold hands." Li shook his head and frankly told the truth. "Husband, you can make the decision on this matter." Rui lowered her head and held his hand tightly. She bit her lower lip and said slowly, "That's all I can do." Li didn't say anything. He just held her tightly with his other arm. After that, there was no sound coming from the room. When the little fellow woke up, Rui went to coax her. He played with her for a while. When he stepped out of the room, he heard the voice behind him again. "Husband, I have a question." Rui's voice was soft. "If I and Sister Zheng fell into the water at the same time, who would you save first?" Bang. When Li Yi stepped out of the door, he tripped heavily and flew straight down the corridor. Fortunately, he reacted quickly and only fell awkwardly when he landed. He was not as miserable as Chen Zhongzhong. Fang stood in the courtyard and looked at this scene in a daze. Then he walked over and sighed, saying, "Young master, think about it. There are no obstacles in life that can't be overcome." Li Yi tidied up his clothes and looked at him in surprise. He asked, "What are you talking about?" Fang patted him on the shoulder, sighed again and said, "Eldest miss will beat and scold you. Just bear with it and it will be over. Don't fight back or you will be beaten even worse." Li Yi frowned and looked at him. "What are you trying to say?" Fang had a puzzled expression on his face and asked, "You've been inside for so long. Didn't eldest miss say anything?" "She did." Li Yi looked at him and said, "Rui asked me to marry Zumo." Strange. Looking at Fang, who was suddenly stunned, Li Yi shook his head and turned to leave. Marry her?" Old Fang turned around and stared blankly at the disappearing figure before he shook his head in disbelief. "There's no justice." Chapter 831. Lili, you've come. When Li Yi walked into the small courtyard in Willow Lane, Xiao Chui lowered her head and spoke. She looked listless. Li Yi looked at her and asked in confusion, "What's wrong, are you not feeling well?" "I'm fine." Xiao Chui looked at him and opened her mouth. In the end, she still shook her head mechanically. Li Yi looked at her and asked, "Do you have something to say to me?" "Miss doesn't allow me to say it." Xiao Chui lowered her head and said, then quickly ran away. Li Yi stood where he was and shook his head. He roughly knew what she wanted to say. Crossing the courtyard, he saw that the door to the art studio was open and walked in. That familiar figure was painting inside. More accurately, she was designing clothes. These things had originally been done by a few people, but in a certain aspect she was actually quite similar to Wan Ruoqing. They were the kind of people who could not stay idle. There was a stove in the room, but if one's hand was left outside for a long time, it would still be a little cold. When Li Yi walked in, she put down her brush and put her two hands by her mouth to breathe. When she saw Li Yi walk in, a trace of panic appeared on her face. Li Yi walked over and wrapped her hands in his. He said, "It's such a cold day. Don't paint anymore. If your hands get frozen, it won't be easy in the future." Being held by him like this, it was very warm and also very comforting. She struggled a few times but could not break free, so she did not resist anymore. She lowered her head and said in a small voice, "I went to your house today. I didn't tell you in advance. I'm sorry." I just thought I should go and see. I didn't think. I know. Li nodded and said, Rui told me everything. She raised her head slightly and said, I didn't want to cause you any trouble. I know. Li nodded and asked, at that time before I went to the Qi Kingdom, did Rui come to look for you? Zheng Zumo's body trembled imperceptibly. She then nodded and said, she came here once. She's your wife and asked about the shop. Mrs. Li is very nice, that's all? She nodded and said, that's all. She told me that too. Li let go of her hand, took a deep breath, held her in his arms and whispered, I'm sorry, that sentence should have been said by me. The delicate body in his arms trembled. Her eyes were filled with tears, but her face was full of smiles. It's nothing, don't blame her. Anyway, I didn't take it seriously. It's nothing, really nothing, last time doesn't count. Li let go of her, held her shoulders and looked into her eyes. She hurriedly wiped her face and lowered her head. Now I'll ask again. Li looked at her and asked, are you willing to marry into the Li family? Although her heart was beating wildly, she still raised her head, sniffed and said, no. If you don't want to, then I'll ask again. Li held her face and asked again, Miss Zheng, are you willing to marry into the Li family? No. Luo Shui goddess, are you willing to marry into the Li family? No. Nanan, are you willing to marry into the Li family? Yes. Xiao Chui stood at the door, clenched her fists and said anxiously, Miss, say you are willing. Xiao Chui was slapped on the butt and left. Zheng Zumo sat on the bed, shook her head and said, I'm fine here. Why would I go to the Li family? Do you want to raise me like a canary? Besides, if I leave, what about Sister Ruoqing? If we leave, she and Xiao Zhu will be the only ones left here. In fact, Li Yi had already thought about this problem before he came. This matter still depended on her choice. For now, this method should be the most suitable. One step at a time. She had already experienced too many setbacks and tribulations to reach this step. She must not be impatient. Xiao Chui poked her head out from the door and said, Li, miss, I know how to solve this matter. Li glanced over there and said, Xiao Chui, close the door. Don't eavesdrop. The little maid pursed her lips and closed the door in a sullen mood. Zheng Zumo looked at him and suddenly said, in 2 days, I want you to accompany me to the Zheng family. Li Yi frowned. Why are we going to the Zheng family? Never mind. Zheng Zumo shook her head again and said, let's wait for a few days. No need to wait. We'll go in 2 days. Li Yi shook his head and said, since it is Nanan's matter, even if it is a mountain of swords and a sea of flames, I have to go. Even if the Zheng family is a dragon's den, I have to go. Don't be serious. Zheng Zumo rolled her eyes at him and said, what mountain of swords and sea of flames? I just want to take over my parents' memorial tablets. Last time I went with Sister Ruoqing. She stopped abruptly at this point. Li frowned and asked, you two went before. Didn't the Zheng family give it to you? Zheng Zumo nodded and said, that was at the beginning of the year. Li patted her hand and said, don't worry, Master Zheng is a sensible person. He will give it to you. Not because of him. Zheng Zumo shook her head and said, let's talk about this in a few days. Li nodded and thought of something. He suddenly asked, let me ask you a question. If Master Zheng and I fell into the water at the same time and you could only save one, who would you save? Zheng Zumo shook her head and said, I don't know how to swim, so. She thought for a moment and seemed to have thought of something. She looked at Li Yi and asked, if it was me and Madame Li who fell into the water, who would you save? Li Yi's expression froze. Don't talk too much, don't talk too much. The more you talk, the more mistakes you make. This was an unchanging truth. Seeing the eyes of the Luo Shui goddess, Li Yi thought for a moment and said, don't worry, Rui will save you. Her martial arts are very high and she can fly by stepping on water. She said this morning that she likes you, so she won't leave you in the lurch. In the carriage, Old Fang couldn't help but ask, son-in-law, was what you said this morning true? Old Fang couldn't help but feel puzzled. Li glanced at him and asked, what is it? Do you have any thoughts? No. Fang shook his head and said, what thoughts can I have? They didn't speak along the way. When Fang returned home and sat at the table, he saw his wife coming out of the kitchen with a tray. He shook his head and sighed. I already said that our family doesn't lack money. We can just hire a few maids to do the cooking and cleaning. The reason for hiring maids wasn't just to clean. They had been eating plain food for decades. Even if they had to change it every 2 days. So what if you have money? You can do whatever you want just because you have money. You might have forgotten the hard times you had in the past, but I haven't. You even hired maids. Mrs. Fang reprimanded him a few times. Then, as if she had thought of something, her brows immediately furrowed. "Hired maids? You even hired a few? Tell me, did you have some devious thoughts again?" "Okay, no more, no more." Seeing that his wife was about to lose her temper again, Fang quickly changed the topic and asked, "What do you want to eat today?" Fang's wife glared at him and said, "Wild vegetable porridge." Fang's face immediately turned bitter. "Ah, wild vegetable porridge again? What's wrong with wild vegetable porridge? I specially went outside the city to pick these wild vegetables to let you know that the hard days before have only passed a few years ago. But didn't I just eat it the day before yesterday?" Fang's face was bitter. He said, "I've eaten it all my life. Can't I change it to something else? For example, the white fungus and lotus seed porridge I had a few days ago. That's the leftover wild vegetables from the day before yesterday. Wait, if you don't want to eat it after eating it all your life, then I've been with you all my life. Are you tired of it?" Fang's wife put down the bowl and chopsticks, picked up a broom and pointed at him. "Tell me who made the white fungus and lotus seed porridge for you. Do you have someone outside?" "Well, I've long heard that when you were outside you always went to the jade courtyard. Do you have someone outside?" Fang's face turned red. He pointed at her and stammered, You're slandering me." "I'm slandering you. Tell me who made the white fungus and lotus seed porridge for you." Can't you learn more from Miss Fang? Well, you've grown up. You even mentioned Miss Fang. If you don't tell me the truth today, you won't be able to live on." After a while, the man who ran out of the house alone stood on the street, rubbed his butt that was hit by the broom, sighed deeply and said to the sky, "There's no justice." Chapter 832. As the end of the year approached, the festive atmosphere in the capital grew stronger. In the Li Manor, the festive atmosphere had not dissipated since the birth of the young master. Today the manor was especially lively. Li Xian's heir's wife brought the little princess to visit. Rui did not have many friends in Jingdo, so the heir's wife was one of the few people she could talk to. Furthermore, she was pregnant at the same time, and the two children were born only a few hours apart. Imperceptibly, there was an additional layer of intimacy between them. The two of them were talking in the room. The two children were hugged by their respective mothers. They looked at each other and stared at each other. In another hall, Li Xian was not convinced and said, "Why not? You have to give me a reason, right?" I said no means no. You don't have to experiment. This method won't work. Just give up. Li Yi waved his hand and said without hesitation. On the road of science he was still standing at the crossroads. He wanted to use two pools, one high and one low, to create a device that would never stop moving and solve the problem of getting water in arid areas. Even if he became the emperor and could change the laws of the Jing kingdom, he could not change the law of conservation of energy, not to mention that he was only a small crown prince. Li Xian said firmly, "I still think this method is feasible. Brother Shen and I have the same idea. Just wait and see. You'll know when the time comes." Li Yi shook his head and said, "There's no need to go through so much trouble. You might as well find a donkey and hang a handful of fresh grass next to its mouth. It won't be able to eat it no matter what. This way it will keep walking forward. You can put that thing on the donkey and let it run in circles. That way it can pump water from a low place to a high place." Li Xian's face showed a thoughtful expression. His eyes grew brighter and brighter. At a certain moment, he suddenly slapped his thigh and said, "Why didn't I think of this method?" Li Yi waved his hand and said, "All right, you can go find your brother Shen and think about it. I have something to say to Emingsu." Li Xian shook his head, sat down and said, "It's quite cold outside. You guys talk. I'll stay here and think. I won't disturb you." Li Yi looked at him without saying a word. Li Xian looked at him and finally thought of something. He stood up and nodded. I understand. It's not safe here. Tell me, I'll go out and keep a lookout for you." Therefore it was very reliable to have such a friend. At critical times he could betray them and keep a lookout. With such a friend, what more could he ask for? Li Yi sat down at the table and poured a cup of tea for the two of them. He asked, "Are you sure you want Xing Shichen to take over after Lord Dong is transferred?" Li Mingzhu nodded and said, "I'm confident in his ability to handle matters, but..." Li Yi knew what she was worried about. When it came to choosing officials, ability was important, but political stance was even more important. A person who was not outstanding but had a firm stance was definitely more worthy of consideration than a person who was outstanding but had a wrong political stance. Li Yi shook his head and said, "Don't worry about this. Lord Xing is a smart man. He knows what choice to make." He had already tested Xing Shichen several times. For such a person, some things didn't need to be said clearly. A look or a casual word could reach some kind of tacit understanding. Taking 10,000 steps back, since Xianxia could help him sit in this position, he could also ask him to step down. As for the specifics, he would have to wait and see. Oh yes, the spring festival is approaching. The Grand Court Conference is coming soon. In another half a month, it will be the Lantern Festival again. A few days ago, the Chui family united with the officials to petition for the King of Shu to be transferred back. What did His Majesty say? Thinking of another matter, Li Yi turned to look at her and asked. Falsification, creating momentum among the people, inciting public opinion. Mingzi shook her head and said, what he did was no different from rebellion. How could father forgive him so easily? He had already ordered the two prime ministers that if they encountered such a petition again, they would directly strike it down. All of His Majesty's children are smarter than the other. How could the King of Shu? A trace of doubt appeared on Li Yi's face. He asked with some surprise, do you think there is a possibility? Mingzi covered his mouth and said with a frown, is this something we can talk about? Li Yi moved her hand away and said innocently, I just want to ask if the King of Shu had a fever when he was young and damaged his brain? Speaking of the King of Shu? A trace of doubt appeared on Mingzhu's face. Even though he is usually a little reckless, it is impossible for him to be so reckless and choose such an opportunity. She looked at Li Yi with a burning gaze and asked, tell me honestly, was it you? We are familiar with each other, but if you talk nonsense like this, I can't do anything to you. He looked at her with a serious expression and said, your status is different now. You must remember to be careful with your words and actions. After reminding her, he stood up and walked out the door. Where are you going? You only have 1 day off. Rest well. I am going to talk to Li Xian about the donkey. The court had always been sensitive. Even the slightest movement would be magnified countless times, not to mention that the capital governor, Dong Wenyun, was about to be transferred to the secretariat to take up an important position. The position of the capital governor might be taken over by the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue, Xianxia. Although it was said to be taking over, it was actually not just taking over. Because there was no news from the court about who would take over the position of the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. This meant that Xianxia was not only the capital governor but also the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. The meaning of this was completely different. The Chui family. The head of the Chui family had a face full of doubt. He paced in the hall and murmured, how could it be Lord Tseng? This time they had indeed used a lot of power and even paid a lot of price to determine the list of candidates for the position of the capital governor. It was to ensure that this position did not fall into the hands of others. However, among them, there were not many who were qualified to take over this position. Helpless, they let Xianxia take up the position. It was better than giving up the position to someone else and risking the risk of losing it to someone else. But no one expected that Xianxia actually went up. Although they did not lose anything and allowed their own people to take the position as they wished, this was completely different from the plan. Even some of the follow-up arrangements were affected. A man stepped forward and said, Big brother, why worry? What difference does it make whether it is Lord Tseng or Lord Qin who goes up? Even if it is different from what we expected, it is still a good thing, isn't it? That being said, I can't figure out the eldest princess's thoughts at all. Which of the others is not more suitable than Lord Tseng? After saying this, he shook his head and said, you are right. No matter what, this is a good thing for us. Go and personally send the invitation. Tomorrow night, we will hold a banquet at the Drunken Moon Tower to congratulate Lord Tseng. The middle-aged man nodded and said, okay, I will go to the Zheng residence right away. Today, she had an appointment with Zumo to go to the Zheng residence to retrieve her parents' memorial tablets. Along the way, the closer she was to the Zheng residence, the slower her steps became. When she was about to reach the gate of the Zheng residence, she finally stopped and could not take another step. Li Yi turned around and found that she was staring at the gate of the Zheng residence with a very complicated look in her eyes. Don't worry, I am here. Li Yi held her hand and squeezed slightly, then strode in the direction of the gate. Chapter 833. Gentlemen, do you have a name card for me to hand in? The gatekeeper of the Zheng residence was very polite. He didn't look like he was going to let them in or announce their arrival. Today there was a joyous occasion in the residence and many important people had come. They couldn't just go and inform everyone that came. Only a good gatekeeper who could help the master choose when to meet and who not to meet and when to meet was a good gatekeeper. The last gatekeeper had let someone in who shouldn't have been, and that was why he was kicked out by the madam. Li Yi held Zheng Zimo's hand and said calmly, You just have to go in and tell Master Zeng that an old friend from Willow Alley is here to visit. He already knew about the changes that had happened to the Zeng family over the past decade, but he was still not very clear about the inside story. Zumo didn't want to admit that she was a member of the Zeng family and didn't want to call Tsing Shichen second uncle. She must have her reasons, so he naturally had to let her be. The gatekeeper smiled and said, "Gentlemen, I'm really sorry, but my master is busy today. Why don't you come another day?" No name card meant that they weren't important people. The two were so young and they didn't even say who they were. They only said they were old friends. Old friends. It was obvious that they had heard that their master had been promoted and wanted to use connections. If it was any other day, he would still go in to inform them just in case. But today was different. If he dampened the mood of the guests, he couldn't afford to be responsible as a lowly gatekeeper. Li didn't come today to reason with the Zeng family, and there was no reason to. The Zeng family wouldn't give him what he wanted, and he had to get it. Under such circumstances, he had to rely on other means to solve the problem. Li looked at the sloppy old man standing not far behind the two. The sloppy old man covered one side of his face and walked over with a slightly gloomy expression. His gloomy expression wasn't because he was being ordered around by Li Yi, but because one of his teeth was broken and half of his face was swollen. Naturally, it caused some emotional fluctuations. "Is Miss back?" The sloppy old man didn't walk over, but an old voice suddenly came from inside the door. The voice was trembling and excited. When the gatekeeper saw him, he immediately bowed and said respectfully, "Housekeeper Ho." The old man called Steward Ho ignored him and quickly walked over. He looked at Tseng Zumo excitedly and said with a trembling voice, 13 years and 9 months. "Miss you, you're finally back." Tseng Zumo looked at him and sighed after a long time. "Uncle Ho, congratulations on your promotion, Lord Tseng. With Lord Tseng's ability, your future career will definitely be smoother. This official will first propose a toast to Lord Zeng." "What are you talking about, Lord Liu? These are all groundless rumors." Tseng Shichen clinked glasses with an official he was familiar with, and another voice came from the other side. "This is not groundless speculation. Lord Zeng's appointment letter has already been seen by someone. I reckon that the court will begin after the Lantern Festival at the latest. The earliest it will be announced will be during the Grand Court Conference. Come, let me also propose a toast to Lord Zeng." After Tseng Shichen clinked glasses again, his body began to sway. Today, with these people coming to the residence, he had already drunk quite a bit. Normally, his tolerance for alcohol was only average, but at this moment he was almost at his limit. A woman dressed in luxurious clothing walked in from outside the door and held his arm. She turned her head and said apologetically, "Sirs, I am truly sorry. Lord Shui is hosting a banquet at Drunken Moon Pavilion tonight. Lord Qin and Lord Qin will also be there. At that time there will be some matters to discuss. My master really cannot drink anymore. Since this is the case, let's quickly let Lord Tseng rest. If something important is ruined, we cannot afford to bear the consequences. Yes, let's quickly let Lord Tseng rest." These people also knew what the surnames Chui, Qin and Qin represented, so they did not stop her. "This woman will not disturb the sirs." The woman looked at the two servant girls beside her and said, "Hurry and help the master to rest." "Yes." As soon as the woman walked out of the hall, a figure hurried over and whispered something in her ear. Hearing this, the woman's brows instantly furrowed. Didn't she already deny being a member of the Zeng family? Why is she causing trouble at this time? A trace of disgust appeared on her face as she said, "The master is already resting. Let's leave her for a while first. When the time comes, find a random reason to send her away." The servant immediately bowed and said yes. Just a jinx. Does she really think she is still the young mistress of the Zeng family? The woman murmured and left with a sullen expression. "Ever since I can remember, Uncle Ho has been taking care of all the chores in the family. Uncle Ho treated me very well back then." While the two were waiting in a side hall, Zeng Zumo looked at the old man standing at the door and whispered. The old man looked around and finally walked in with a smile on his face. He looked at Li Yi and asked, "Miss, this gentleman is?" "I am her husband." Li Yi held her hand and looked at the old man with a smile. "Zumo is indebted to Uncle Ho for taking care of me when I was young." Zeng Zumo blushed but didn't resist. She held his hand even tighter. The old man was startled when he heard this. He looked him up and down a few times before a smile appeared on his old face again. He said, "So it's the son-in-law. You're really a talented man. You're a perfect match for Miss." He looked at Li Yi for a while before a servant came in and said, "The master is drunk and is resting in his room. If you want to see the master, wait for him to wake up or come back tomorrow. Drunk? Li shook his head and said, it seems that Lord Tseng is really in high spirits. He's not at the Ministry of Revenue's Yamen at this time, but is actually drinking and having fun at home. He hasn't even become the capital governor yet. The servant was startled and then said angrily, what did you say? All right, you can leave. Steward Ho waved his hand at him. The servant wanted to say something but could only swallow his anger and leave after being glared at by the steward. Steward Ho finally looked at Li Yi and said in a small voice, son-in-law, this is the Zeng residence. Be careful with your words, careful with your words. Careful with what words? Where is Tsing Shichen? I would like to ask, is this how he usually serves the court as an assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue? Zheng Zumo pulled on Li Yi's sleeve as soon as he took a step forward. She looked at him and shook her head, then turned to Steward Ho and asked, Uncle Ho, can we take a walk around the residence? The old man nodded. This is the Zeng residence, of course you can. However, the residence has changed greatly. Let me lead the young mistress and son-in-law. A quarter of an hour later, in front of a courtyard in the Zeng residence. Zheng Zumo stood in front of the courtyard door for a long time before asking, Uncle Ho, can we go in? Apart from the maids and servants who clean regularly, the master usually does not allow anyone to enter. The old man hesitated for a moment before saying, but since it is the young mistress, I believe that even if the master knew, he would not blame you. Thank you, Uncle Ho. Zheng Zumo smiled faintly at the old man. She reached out her hand and the courtyard door creaked open. Li followed her inside. No matter how he looked at it, this was just an ordinary courtyard with nothing out of the ordinary. There was a stone table and chairs in the courtyard, and a swing hanging from a tree on the left side of the wall. The table and chairs were spotless. She walked over and touched them with her hand, surveying her surroundings. Finally, she walked under the swing. This is where father, mother, and I used to live. She sat on the swing and said, there's also this swing. My father tied it up for me. One time I swung too high and fell from it. My father put the swing away. I begged him for a long time before he agreed. But this swing is no longer the same as the one from before. And here there's half a tile missing, but it's still the same. Look here, this is the name I carved on the tree when I was young. Unfortunately, it's been a long time and I can't see it clearly anymore. Here, this brick can actually be taken down. When I was young, I hid things inside and father and mother did not know. She really did take down the brick in the corner. Actually, it was only half a brick, so there was a small space inside. She took out a yellowed paper bag from inside. The paper bag was torn apart and there was some black residue inside. The words Suji Worldwide Commerce could be faintly seen on the paper bag. She stood up, clapped her hands and murmured, this place is exactly the same as before. Li held her hand and asked, do you like it here? She nodded slightly and said softly, coming here, I remembered many things from the past. As long as you like it. Li nodded, looked around and murmured, as long as you like it. Chapter 834. When the two walked out of the yard, Zheng Zumo looked around again and asked the old man, Uncle Ho, the garden in the back? The old man nodded and said, it's there, it's exactly the same as before. She held onto Li Yi's hand, a look of reminiscence on her face. That garden is where we used to play hide and seek when we were young. I know a place where once hidden, no one can find it no matter how hard they try. As they walked in the direction of the garden, she said with some regret, unfortunately, it's winter now. If we wait until summer when the leaves are the densest, it would be the best place to play hide and seek. Li shook his head and said, it's okay, then we'll play in summer. Besides, it's our home so we can play whenever we want. She shook her head and said, that was before. Li looked around and murmured, it will be the same in the future. Congratulations, Zijian. Master Zheng has been promoted to the capital governor and is also the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue. This is rare even in the previous two dynasties. It's my father who was promoted, it has nothing to do with me. Zijian just likes to be humble. That's not right. Master Zheng's career is smooth, and the Zheng family's status in the capital will naturally rise. Zijian, perhaps your matter will also be loosened. In the stone pavilion in the center of the garden, screens were erected on all four sides to block out the cold. A large stove was lit in the center of the stone pavilion, and there was a copper pot on top of the stove. Boiling water bubbled in the pot. Several young people around the stove put meat and vegetables into the pot to cook, chatting as they ate. The screens blocked out the cold outside and wrapped in the heat inside, so there was no cold inside at all. Zheng Zijian picked up the wine warmed in the small stove and took a sip. He shook his head and said, "It's not easy to overturn an edict personally issued by the current emperor. I don't want to become an official anymore. There's nothing wrong with being a good-for-nothing young master waiting to die." The young man on his left dipped a mouthful of mutton and comforted him. "Zijian, don't be discouraged. In at least a year, at most 2 or 3 years, this decree will be nullified. It's not like you don't know His Majesty's health. How long do you think he can hold on? Lord Zeng is now highly promoted and will definitely be highly regarded by the King of Shu in the future. When that time comes, Zijian's matters will only require a word from His Highness." Zeng Zijian glanced at him and said, "Brother Han, be careful with your words." The young man said disapprovingly, "This is the Zeng family, your territory. Zijian, you're too cowardly. Is there anyone who can hear us?" He shook his head and dipped another mouthful of mutton. Then he smacked his lips and said, "It's said that this thing called hot pot was created by that Li Yi. Tell me, as a county marquis and a minister of Jinzi Guanglu, why does he like these crooked ways instead of doing proper work?" Just as he finished speaking, a corner of the screen was lifted up to reveal a passage. Li Yi poked half of his body in and said with a frown, "I can pretend that I didn't hear what you said earlier about His Majesty not having 2 years to live, but don't you think it's a little too much to say such things while eating hot pot?" Li Yi looked at Zeng Zijian and asked, "Young Master Zeng, what do you think?" Why are you here?" The wine pot in Zeng Zijian's hand fell to the ground and his expression changed drastically. As for that young Master Han, his face turned from white to green and then to white again. The words, "Just now you said that His Majesty doesn't have 2 years to live," echoed in his mind. He suddenly stood up from his seat. If these words were to reach His Majesty's ears, no matter what position the Han family held in the imperial court, it wouldn't be an exaggeration to exterminate them. Clang. Because he stood up too abruptly, his thigh bumped into the stove. The copper pot on the stove shook violently before it toppled over. The boiling hot soup splashed everywhere. Then there were a few ear-piercing screams of terror. The screens on the 4 sides were knocked down by the people and fell to the ground. When the copper pot rolled down, Li Yi simply turned around and grabbed Miss Zeng by the waist. With a light leap he landed under the pavilion. With a soft body in his arms, Li Yi looked at the people who ran out of the pavilion with ferocious expressions and took off their shoes and jumped on the spot. He sighed and said, "Although hot pot is delicious, the water is so hot. You have to be careful when eating it." The screams quickly attracted the guards of the Zeng residence. A middle-aged woman hurried over from behind. After seeing Zeng Zijian's pained expression, her expression changed and she hurriedly said, "Zijian, what's wrong? What happened?" Zeng Zijian clenched his teeth and looked at Li Yi with frightened eyes. He shook his head and said, "No, it's nothing. I just accidentally knocked over the soup pot. Mother, don't worry. Stay here and don't move." The woman said to him, then turned around and said to the guards sternly, "Why are you still standing here? Quick, go get the doctor." In addition to Zeng Zijian, 3 other people were drenched by the boiling water. However, it was only a slight burn and some flesh pain. Apart from being temporarily unable to move, they were fine. Seeing that Zeng Zijian was fine, the middle-aged woman stood up and glanced in a certain direction. She strode over and looked at Zeng Zumo with a frown. "What are you doing here?" Zeng Zumo grasped Li Yi's hand and walked out. She looked at the middle-aged woman and said calmly, "I'm here to take back my parents' spirit tablet." "Spirit tablet?" The middle-aged woman pouted. "Your parents are sinners of the Zeng family. They brought shame to the ancestors of the Zeng family and let their spirit tablet occupy a corner of the ancestral hall. What are you dissatisfied with?" Li Yi felt her grip on his hand was a bit tight, so he gently patted the back of her hand. "My father was framed by someone," Yi Zichen said. Zeng Zumo looked at her and said word by word, "You have already expelled him from the Zeng family. He is no longer a member of the Zeng family. Now I am going to take back their spirit tablet." The middle-aged woman sneered. "I wonder if your dead parents would want their spirit tablet to be placed in the ancestral hall of the Zeng family or in the hands of a dirty prostitute." Li Yi suddenly felt a stinging pain on the back of his hand. It was because her nails had sunk into the flesh of his hand. "It's okay, I will take care of it." He stepped forward, shielding her behind him. He turned around and whispered. The middle-aged woman was startled and frowned. "What are you? Zeng Shichen is quite smart. Why did he marry a thing like you?" Li Yi looked at the middle-aged woman and shook his head. "You, slap." As soon as the middle-aged woman opened her mouth, a loud sound was heard, followed by a burning pain on one side of her face. "This slap is for what you said just now." Slap. As the middle-aged woman froze in place, her face full of disbelief, Li Yi flipped his hand again. This slap is because you scolded me earlier. Let me correct you, I am Li Yi, not. Li Yi stopped in time. After thinking about it, he looked at her with dissatisfaction. You still want to play tricks with me? Slap. Another crisp slap rang out. This slap is a trick. Chapter 835. In fact, Li Yi himself did not like to slap faces. The effect of force was mutual, equal in magnitude and opposite in direction, acting on the same straight line. From a physical point of view, this was an act of hurting the enemy 1,000 times while hurting oneself 1,000 times. He disliked hitting women even more. Hitting women was a sign of a man's incompetence. However, for some people who were extremely hateful, so hateful that people ignored their gender, a loss was a loss. He had to be happy and clear his mind. In fact, he wanted to lose a few thousand more, but he was held back by drunken Mo. She looked up at Li Yi and shook her head slightly. Li Yi nodded and said, Don't worry, we are here to reason things out today. Li. Zheng Zijin looked at him fiercely, and a beast-like growl came from his throat. Li Yi raised his hand and pressed down, saying, Don't move, you are still injured. He had only used ordinary strength when he slapped the middle-aged woman just now, otherwise her face would not have been so simply swollen. But even so, it was enough for her to freeze on the spot and not come back to her senses for a long time. You dare to hit me? When the blankness in her eyes became clear, the middle-aged woman looked at him in disbelief and said in a trembling voice. This was the Zheng family and she was the mistress of the Zheng family. How could she be slapped 3 times by an outsider in front of so many people? Li Yi said politely, Each of these 3 slaps is reasonable. If Madame feels that you are still unclear about which slap and feel wronged, I can explain it to you again. The middle-aged woman stretched out her hand and pointed at him tremblingly. She said to the remaining 2 guards, Catch him, catch him. Just as the 2 guards were about to move, a burst of noisy footsteps came from behind. Tsong, what's wrong with you? Why is your face so pale? Mingda, what's wrong with your foot? Go Shing, you guys. A few men hurried over from behind. When they saw the young men wailing in pain or with twisted expressions, their expressions immediately changed and they asked with concern. This was especially so for a middle-aged man with the surname Han. When he saw his son's pale face, trembling body, and the obvious smell of urine coming from his lower body, he could not suppress the anger on his face. He stood up abruptly and said angrily, Who did this? Who did this? Lord Han, you seem to be very free today. Li Yi smiled at the middle-aged man who had lost his composure. His smile was very kind, but in the eyes of Lord Han, it was no less than a demon. For some people in the capital, this was the smile of the devil. A smile from a demon could destroy a family if it was light, and exterminate an entire clan if it was heavy. Lord Li. Lord Han's legs turned to jelly and he sat back down. The other 2, who were just about to stick their bodies out, shrank back and turned their heads to look around, pretending to be enjoying the scenery in the garden. Li Yi had some impression of this Lord Han. He was the Minister of Revenue, and was considered the 2nd or 3rd most important person in the Han family of the capital. He was not familiar with the other 2. He looked at them and asked, These 2 lords are? The 2 of them knew that they couldn't hide anymore, so they immediately bowed. I am Feng Kuan, the Minister of Revenue. Greetings, Lord Li. I am Wei Jin, the Minister of Granaries. Greetings, Lord Li. No need to stand on ceremony, no need to stand on ceremony. Li smiled and waved his hand. He asked, How was the banquet at the Zheng residence? Was it passable? The 3 couldn't figure out what this Lord Li meant. Lord Han immediately nodded and said, It was all right. It seems that Lord Zheng's hospitality is not bad. Li Yi nodded his head and asked, Since you've eaten and drank, why don't you tell me why you're drinking and celebrating here before it's time to close the yamen? Could it be that the Ministry of Revenue's yamen has moved to Assistant Minister Zheng's Fu? Hearing this, the 3 were speechless at the same time and cold sweat began to drip from their foreheads. Although there was a fixed time for the opening and closing of the yamen, it only needed to be done in the morning. As for when to close the yamen, it depended on the specific number of errands that each person had. This was a tacit practice that everyone agreed on. There were also some officials who did not work in the yamen. Therefore, if their superiors did not care, they could go home early or do some other things. However, this did not mean that they could drink and have fun during the normal court hours. This crime could be serious or minor. If it was a minor one, they would be fined. If it was a serious one, they would be demoted. But who knew that they would be caught by the minister of the imperial court while drinking in the Zheng mansion? Li, County Marquis Li, Tseng Shichen walked over quickly with the help of a servant. Hearing that there was trouble in the mansion, he immediately sobered up a little. Seeing the two people standing in the courtyard, he squeezed out a smile on his face. "Zumo, you're here too," Li shook his head. "Lord Tseng is really in a good mood, Lord?" Seeing Tseng Shichen coming, the middle-aged woman immediately burst into tears. Pointing at Li Yi and Zheng Zumo, she said loudly, "This prostitute brought her." "Shut up!" Tseng Shichen's face suddenly showed anger. His almost roaring voice scared the woman to the spot. Looking at the woman's swollen cheek, he waved his hand and said, "Come, take the lady back." Then he looked at Li Yi and said, "County Marquis Li, this is not the place to talk. This way, please." He glanced at Tseng Zijin behind him. "You come with me." Seeing those people leave, Lord Han looked at his son who was still sitting on the ground. An inexplicable anger rose in his heart. He kicked him and scolded, "Tell me what happened just now. Father, father, help." Before the young man finished his words, Lord Han's face turned pale. What? Your Majesty?" He shuddered, then fell limply to the ground, his face full of despair. The other two assistant counselors and manager of the Ministry of Revenue were also scared out of their wits. They fiercely grabbed their sons' collars and angrily said, "Speak! Did you say anything you shouldn't have? Speak!" After stepping into the room, Tseng Shichen turned back and bowed. "Zumo, if your aunt said anything she shouldn't have said, I apologize to you here." Zheng Zumo hurriedly dodged and didn't accept the bow. "I don't care what she said. I just want to bring back my parents' memorial tablets today." Tseng Shichen raised his head and revealed a troubled expression. Back then, Big Brother was framed by a scoundrel. In order to protect the Zheng family, your grandmother expelled him from the family. However, he is still a member of the Zheng family. Don't worry, I will clear Big Brother's name and restore his identity. Zheng Zumo closed her eyes and took a deep breath, saying slowly, "No need. 13 years ago they were no longer members of the Zheng family. 13 years later they still aren't. I will worship their memorial tablets well and won't take up space in the Zheng family's ancestral shrine." "Zumo?" Li shook his head and interrupted him. He looked at him and said slowly, "Lord Tseng, we didn't come here today to listen to you." Tseng Shichen looked at him and said, "Lord Li, this is the Zheng family's business. I hope you won't interfere." "Sorry, I think Lord Tseng is mistaken about one thing." Li Yi held her hand and looked at Tseng Shichen. "This is not the Zheng family's business. It's the Li family's business." Chapter 836. "You, the Li family," Tseng Shichen murmured and looked at the two with a new gaze. You have already?" Li met his eyes and nodded. Tseng Shichen was stunned for a long time before nodding. "Okay, that's fine." He looked at Li Yi and said again, "My brother and sister-in-law have passed away. It is the best choice for their spirit tablets to be placed in the ancestral shrine. I, Tseng Shichen, swear to the heavens that I will clear my brother's grievances in my lifetime and let their spirit tablets be placed in front of the Zheng family's ancestral shrine with dignity." Zheng Zumo looked up at him with a hint of emotion in her eyes. Li shook his head and said, "Lord Zheng is Lord Zheng and the Zheng family is the Zheng family. I can represent the Zheng family. If you could represent the Zheng family, we wouldn't be here today." Li waved his hand and asked, "So are you going to bring it over or should we go get it?" Tseng Shichen shook his head and said, "Outsiders are not allowed to enter the ancestral shrine of the Zheng family. Let me go get it." Then he glanced at Zheng Zijin and said, "Zijin, come with me." Li took Zheng Zumo's hand and sat down. He asked, "Did he say the same thing to you last time?" Zheng Zumo shook her head and said, "Last time he wasn't in the manor because..." She didn't continue, but it wasn't hard to imagine what had happened last time, judging from the woman's attitude toward her just now. A trace of hostility rose in Li Yi's heart. He really should have found a few more reasons and slapped her a few more times. Suddenly he caught a glimpse of a head peeking at the door. He frowned and said coldly, "Who is sneaking around there?" "Misunderstanding, Lord, you misunderstood. It's me." Lord Han hurriedly walked in from outside and bowed. "It's all my fault for not teaching my son well. My son is naughty and mischievous and offended Lord Li. I hope you can forgive him and forgive him this time." Li waved his hand and said, "The one who misunderstood is Master Han. Speaking of which, it was I who disturbed your son and caused him to be scalded by the hot water. I don't know how his injuries are, I hope Master Han won't blame me." How could it be? How could it be? Official Han repeatedly waved his hand and breathed a sigh of relief in his heart. If that's the case, this lowly official will take his leave. Go, go. Li Yi waved his hand again. Since your son is injured, there is no harm in recuperating for 2 days. As for him talking about his majesty behind his majesty's back, we'll talk about it in 2 days. Hearing this, Sir Han's legs went soft and his forehead was covered in cold sweat. He anxiously said, Sir, it's a misunderstanding, it's all a misunderstanding. Even if my son was given the guts of the heavens, he wouldn't dare to talk about his majesty. Don't worry, Sir Han. Since it's a misunderstanding, I believe the Intelligence Bureau will definitely clear your son's name. Intelligence Bureau? Sir Han's expression changed wildly. After muttering a few words, he slowly raised his head and said with some resentment, Sir Li, do you really want to exterminate my Han family? Do you think that without any evidence, just based on your one-sided words, His Majesty will believe it and go to great lengths to deal with my Han family? Whether His Majesty will believe it or not, don't you know in your heart, Sir Han? Thump. Sir Han's legs went soft and he knelt on the ground, crying out, Sir Li, spare me. Sir Han, you're leaving? Zheng Shichen walked to the door of the room with the 2 wooden boxes in his arms and happened to see Sir Han walking out. Sir Han's face was pale. He wiped the cold sweat on his forehead with his sleeve and said, There are still some matters in the yamen. I will take my leave first. Sorry for disturbing you today. After saying goodbye to Sir Han, Zheng Shichen walked into the room and handed the wooden box to Zuemo. When you've thought it through, you can come back to find me at any time. Zuemo opened the wooden box and looked inside, then closed it again. She stood up with the wooden box and bowed slightly. Thank you. She turned to look at Li Yi and whispered, Let's go back. Li Yi patted her hand. Sit here for a while. I have something to say to Sir Zue. He looked at Zheng Shichen. Sir Zue, can we talk in private? Zheng Shichen nodded, and the 2 went to a side hall. Li Yi casually cupped his hands. I haven't congratulated Sir Zue on your promotion to the capital governor. Zheng Shichen cupped his hands in return. It's all thanks to Sir Li. If he still didn't know what Li Yi meant that day in the palace, then he would have lived all these years in vain. Since you know it's all thanks to me? Li Yi nodded. Then surely Sir Zue won't mind doing me a small favor? Although Zheng Shichen had already guessed that this matter was related to him, he did not expect that he would not shirk away at all. After a moment of shock, Zheng Shichen looked at him cautiously and asked, I wonder what Lord Li wants me to help with? Li Yi looked at him and asked, The capital governor has his own mansion, right? Although he didn't know what he meant, Zheng Shichen nodded. The court has indeed built a mansion for the capital governor. It's in the yamen of the capital. After Sir Zue takes office, will you move to the capital governor's mansion? Zheng Shichen looked at him suspiciously. What does Marquis Li mean? Just say it. Then I'll say it. Li Yi looked around, then turned his head and said, I want the Zheng mansion. Li Yi looked at him with a burning gaze. I want you to move out. I want the Zheng mansion. Sir Zue, name your price. What? Zheng Shichen was stunned, then shook his head. That's impossible. This is the Zheng family's ancestral mansion. How could we sell it to you? Besides, the capital governor's mansion is only a temporary residence. If there's a change of position, where do you want me to live? Sir Zue can buy another mansion. In any case, the Zheng mansion's location isn't very good. Change the place, change the feng shui and change the mood. Who knows, maybe your luck will turn around and your career will be smoother. Li Yi looked at him and said, There are many good places in the capital. Why does Sir Zue need to guard this place? No, that's absolutely not possible. Zheng Shichen shook his head and said resolutely, The ancestral mansion can't be abandoned easily. I spent a lot of effort to regain it. Please forgive me for not being able to help you. Li Yi sighed and said, Sir Zue, this is the first time I'm asking for your help. I'm powerless in this matter. Sir Zue, you know me? Li Yi looked at him and said with a smile, I'm the kind of person who will do anything to achieve my goals. Zheng Shichen looked at him and asked, Do you want to rob me if I don't agree? Sir Zue, don't joke around. Wouldn't that make you a robber? Li Yi shook his head and said, I'm a decent person. I won't do that kind of thing. How about I find a new place for you? I guarantee that it's better and safer than this place. Moreover, the Zheng family definitely won't blame you. Zheng Shichen had a bad premonition and asked, Where? The Ministry of Justice's prison. What does Sir Zue think? If Sir Zue thinks the Ministry of Justice's prison isn't good, that's fine. There are also the Supreme Court's prison and the Secret Intelligence Bureau's prison to choose from. However, I don't recommend going to the last one. It's easy to get in there but difficult to get out. It should be much cheaper to buy this place from the imperial court. Zheng Shichen's expression changed. What do you mean? When I was in the garden just now, I accidentally heard your son discussing state affairs with someone. I have to say Sir Zue's family is quite good. Young Master Zheng is very concerned about the state and the people, as well as His Majesty's health. He's especially worried about who will succeed His Majesty when he passes away in a year or two. That was clearly what that kid from the Han family said. I'm not sure about that. Li shook his head and said, there's a screen outside, so how would I know who said it? But it doesn't matter. When the time comes we'll find out. The Secret Intelligence Bureau is the best at these things. Zheng Shichen looked at him and asked word by word, what use does the Zheng family mansion have to you? Why are you so insistent? It's useless to me. Li shook his head. But she likes it. Zheng Shichen was stunned when he heard this, and his face quickly showed a look of realization. It's drunk ink. He shook his head and said, forget about the Ministry of Justice's prison. Find a better place. Li shook his head and said, she doesn't know about this. Don't tell her yet, Sir Zue. Zheng Shichen looked at him deeply and said, you have to let the Zheng family have a good new year, right? Of course. Li Yi nodded, thought for a moment and asked, can we get a 20% discount after the new year? Chapter 837. What did you just say? Zheng Zumo turned around and asked Li Yi curiously when they walked out of the Zheng mansion and strolled back to Willow Lane. Nothing. Li Yi shook his head and said, holding 2 wooden boxes, I asked Master Zheng what kind of dowry he planned to prepare for you. I haven't agreed yet. I don't care. Why are you so shameless? Why don't you like it? I like it. After entering the room and placing her parents' memorial tablets, Li Yi and she burned incense and sat on the bedside. She looked at the lit incense and murmured, at that time the government said that my father embezzled the grain and sent people to arrest him. The Zheng family, they threw our things out of the house, saying that my father had done such a thing, so he was not a member of the Zheng family and should not be a burden to the Zheng family. She gradually tightened her grip on Li Yi's hand, and her voice became lower and lower. My mother committed suicide, my father was arrested by the government, and I was also taken away by them to the musical house. It sounds nice, but no one knows what kind of place it is. Several sisters I met in it died soon after. I remember one time, I only ate a moldy steamed bun for 3 days. At that time I was so afraid that one day I would be like them. It's all in the past, all in the past. Li put his arm around her shoulder and gently stroked her hair, with a trace of tenderness in his eyes. It was no wonder that she was always so secretive about her previous experiences. The things that she had suffered during that period of time, if it was anyone else, they would not be willing to easily mention it. Her eyes were slightly absent-minded and she murmured, later my mother bought me from the musical house and brought me to the Qing mansion. At that time I swore that I would never come back to this place in my life. Li lowered his head and asked softly, then why did you come back? Because Sister Ruoqing is here. She turned her head to look at Li Yi and said, because you are also here? Li Yi pinched her nose and said, so you had been thinking about me since then? Thank you. She leaned comfortably in Li Yi's arms, closed her eyes and let out a long sigh. Li Yi asked in surprise, what are you thanking me for? Yes, thank you. There's not much sincerity in just saying thank you. Before Li Yi could finish his words, 2 soft lips were imprinted on him. Today's weather was good. Even people's moods couldn't help but become better. They couldn't help but think of some happy things. Walking out of Willow Lane, he saw Fang beside the carriage. Li Yi was surprised and asked, why are you here? When I passed by just now, I saw the carriage and guessed that the son-in-law must be here. Fang straightened up and asked, are we going home now? I'm not going back yet. Li Yi shook his head and said, send someone to the Zheng residence to hand over an invitation and invite Zheng Shichen out. Just now Zue Amo was also at the Zheng residence, so it wasn't appropriate to ask too much. But since everything had been said today, he naturally couldn't pretend that he didn't know some things. Okay, I'll send someone right away. Fang jumped off the carriage and turned back to say, son-in-law, let me remind you. When you go back today, don't smile like you did just now. Like what? Like when you walked out of Willow Lane. Li raised his eyebrows and asked, why? Because. Fang opened his mouth and shook his head. Anyway, as long as the son-in-law remembers what I said. Strange. Li glanced at him and said to the sloppy old man, "Go to the tea house closest to the Zeng residence." In the tea house, Zeng Shichen seemed to be in better spirits than before, and the smell of alcohol had mostly dissipated. Before sitting down, he hurriedly asked, "Is there anything else important?" Li poured a cup of tea and asked, "I want to know about Zue Mo's father. What kind of case was he involved in back then?" Zeng Shichen paused, and the hand that reached for the teacup retracted. He said in a low voice, "They framed him for embezzling the grain and delayed the battle, which was an important reason for the defeat of a certain war with the Qi kingdom." Li frowned and asked, "With your ability you haven't found anything after so many years?" Zeng Shichen shook his head. "There are many people who know that Big Brother was framed, but none of them really stood out and were willing to vindicate him. Even if they found out, the only person who could be found in this case was the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue at that time. If we continue to investigate, it will do more harm than good. Besides, it has been so long, there is no way to investigate." Li thought for a moment, looked at him and asked, "What about the assistant minister of the Ministry of Revenue at that time?" Later, because of corruption, he was exiled with his whole family. Since it was an exile, there are traces to follow. Zeng Shichen shook his head and said, "We can't follow them." At this point there was no need to continue. Li glanced at Zeng Shichen, shook his head slightly and said, "We still have to investigate. There is no truth that can't be found out. Otherwise you wouldn't have said those words today." Zeng Shichen was silent. After a moment, he raised his head and looked at Li, saying, "I'll leave this matter to you. It's not a request. Even if you don't, I must do it." Li shook his head and said, "Regarding this matter, you definitely have more information than I do. Another day, invite Assistant Minister Lu of the Ministry of Justice to a meal. We still have to rely on him for this matter. Also, regarding the Zeng family's mansion." Zeng Shichen waved his hand and said, "That mansion, if you want it, you can have it. The Zeng family is no longer the original Zeng family. There is no point in keeping that mansion. In comparison, Zue Mo needs it more." Li looked at him and said, "There are still a few months before Zue Mo's birthday. I want to give the Zeng family mansion as a gift to her. Lord Zeng shouldn't forget what the Zeng family was like 13 years ago, right?" "Of course I won't forget. Every flower and grass, every wood and stone of the Zeng family, they are all." He glanced at Li, nodded slightly and said, "You are thoughtful. When the time comes I will have to trouble Lord Zeng." Li stood up and said, "Her Royal Highness values Lord Zeng very much. Lord Zeng should stay close to the virtuous officials and stay away from the evil ones. In the future you will definitely have a bright future." Zeng Shichen naturally knew what this sentence meant. He said calmly, "County Marquis Li, please tell Her Royal Highness that I will not let her down. In addition, thank you for the transfer of the capital governor. This is Her Royal Highness's wish. It has nothing to do with me." Li waved his hand and walked to the door. Watching him walk out and disappear, Zeng Shichen murmured in a voice that only he could hear, "Isn't your wish the princess's?" Li's figure appeared at the door again. He glanced at Zeng Shichen and said lightly, "Lord Zeng, you will be the capital governor soon. Be careful with your words." There was no need to worry about the Zeng family for the time being. Not to mention others, Zeng Shichen still had some conscience. Although Zue Mo didn't show it on the surface, he was her second uncle after all. She still had some hope in her heart. Speaking of which, after returning from the Zeng family, she seemed to be more open. This was a good sign. Thinking of the kiss during the day, Li couldn't help but smile. "What are you thinking about? Why are you so happy?" Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked with her arms crossed in front of her chest. When Li was thinking about why he was so happy, Mississippi Lu suddenly took a step forward and reached out to his chest. "What are you doing?" Li asked warily. She had retracted her hand and pinched a strand of long black hair between her fingers. She looked at him and asked, "Whose hair is it?" Such as, Li suddenly remembered that Rui went out early in the morning at the invitation of the princess, and Xuanhuan naturally went with her. Proud Lolita's hair didn't have such long hair, not to mention Yong Ning's. He couldn't say it was Fong's, could he? And this matter was not suitable for Mississippi Lu to know for the time being. "I don't know." Li looked surprised and looked at her and said, "Why don't you guess?" You're tuning in to the Sword Dance in the Vast Sky YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.